Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so.
Another fight. This is getting tiring. It was the closing time when I heard another commotion coming from inside. Why couldn't they do it outside? It was the 7th fight since this morning. I walked in and asked the group fighting to take it outside, but I think they had their ears closed as they continued ignoring me. These are the reasons why I sometimes hate my job. Holding back on handing these kinds of people's asses in their hands was something that I found hard. I quickly stepped in and took control of the physical altercation by restraining the man throwing punches. I expertly defended myself by delivering a swift blow to his stomach, and then another to his jaw. Despite his futile attempts to hit me, I skillfully dodged his swings. The others involved in the fight had stopped now, not daring to butt in, as I shot a warning look at them before throwing them out of the bar. "You're going to regret it." The man's tone revealed his shame for getting bested by a guard in front of his friends. He had no idea I went easy on him, not that I would tell him. "Yeah, go ahead, do whatever you can," I replied, tired of all these shits. After closing the bar, I walked to the parking lot, where I saw 2 server girls making out with each other. They were too into each other's mouths to notice my presence. Not that I cared. I started my bike, causing them to startle, and drove away. Once upon a time, I was a fighter of an infamous gang, and now I work as a security guard in one of the Ojos Locos bars. My life was far better when I was a gang member than now. In terms of holding back my fists since I never needed to, living in San Antonio gets tiring sometimes. It would be great to relocate to either New York or LA to get away from all of this, but it's not an option for someone with family commitments, especially if their spouse doesn't agree with their choice. Speak of the devil. I looked at the incoming call on the phone screen and it was Samantha. I'm on my way home. Sure, I'll grab some. I thought about when she would call, as it had become her habit. She wanted me to buy some eggs and some chocolates for her cravings, so I took a U-turn as I had already passed the last open store. While shopping, I noticed 2 men having an argument that seemed to be getting heated. It was clear that things could turn physical if no one stepped in. Since it was not my problem, I paid for my items and exited the store. Being in the same shoes, I made sure to inform the guard as a gesture of understanding and sympathy. I started my bike and drove toward my home, unaware of the horrifying scene awaiting me. Something seemed very wrong when I found the house door unlocked, and it wasn't like Samantha to leave it open. She was extra careful regarding such things since it was unsafe these days. All the lights were off as I walked in, and I could hear a faint grunting voice coming from upstairs. My heart started racing in trepidation as I rushed there, only to freeze at the end of the stairs. My heart throbbed in agony as I saw my wife groaning in a pool of blood. She was stabbed in her lower abdomen, and it seemed blood came between her legs, too. Who in the world could have done this? My body trembled at the sight of her faint, fading breath. Antonio, our baby. Save her. She barely managed to let these words out while I dialed 911. I was panicked, I was angry, but I was also helpless. Samantha passed out after muttering a few more words which I couldn't understand, but the name I heard was Luis. I would destroy whoever it was, whether Luis or somebody else. An ambulance arrived in less than 20 minutes, and she was immediately taken to the emergency. I did suspect it when I saw her in that condition, but doctors confirmed after carefully examining the injuries that she was violated. It was the 23rd week of her pregnancy, and the baby had died inside her womb. Between the murder of my unborn child and my wife's near-death state, I was losing my mind. I would wreak havoc if she died too. Within the hours she was in the surgery room, I contacted the people who could give me information about him. I had already given my statement to the police, but I would not rely on them and their slow procedures to find the person behind this. Those who still respected me from my twisted past were ready to help me. As the last call disconnected, I was informed that the surgery was over and her life was saved, but she hadn't regained consciousness yet, and they didn't know when she will. I sat beside her bed the entire night, reflecting on how I failed to protect the one person who accepted me for who I was, cared for me, and loved me. What was I going to tell her about our baby? She would be devastated. The police had begun their investigation, and I, filled with rage, was on my quest to find Luis. Even if it wasn't him, I was sure he was somehow involved, judging by how Samantha uttered his name. Wait. Oh my God, how could I forget this? How about, "I'm craving chocolate," she said, her voice breathier than usual because of the pleasure she just received. "And what if you're craving chocolate for real?" I asked, playing with her hair. "If I want chocolate, then I'll say something else. But if I ever say this, know that you need to rush to my side as soon as possible," she said, her head on my chest, her skin touching mine, and her smell mingled with mine, turning me on again. "Sure, love, but I'll make sure you don't need to use the code word in the first place," I whispered in her ears, and flipped her over, before putting my face between those perky glands. That meant he was there when she called me. How could I be so stupid to forget that? I thought she was getting pregnancy cravings. I could have been there to save her. Amidst my self-loathing thoughts, my phone started to ring. I took it out of my pocket and saw Peter's name flashing on the screen. My men found him. My body inflamed with fury as I heard these words. "Where is he?" I asked calmly, yet my voice was laced with venom. "He is hiding at Old Man Jeffrey's house. Since his place was empty after his death, he started using it, and no one suspected him." I clenched my cell phone. He should have stayed still, but now that he chose to act out, his days were over. I kissed Samantha's forehead and whispered that I would return to her side soon, before heading out. "I swear, man, I know nothing of this," Luis pleaded while I grabbed him by his collar and asked him what he did. "You know all too well that messing up with me is a bad idea, Luis." I wrapped my other hand around his neck as I snarled, "I'm telling the truth. I didn't know something happened to your wife until you told me." His legs were shaky, and whether he was telling the truth or lying, I would not leave this place without my answer. "You were there, and Samantha told me this before passing out. It's your choice now. Tell me the truth, or I assume you did everything and killed you. And you know bluffing is not my forte." She never said anything about his involvement, and I was bluffing, which, judging by his reaction, was working. "Marissa." I flinched at the mention of this name. "And Jose, they came to me a few days ago." His voice shook as he spoke, meaning he knew something and was scared. "You mean your brother Jose?" He nodded his head in response. Right after asking him this, I remembered Samantha used to get confused with these two's names when we were still in the dating stage and I was still in the gang. They were asking questions about you and your wife. I swear I wouldn't have told him if it wasn't for my secret. I could see the apparent panic on his face, but it only intensified my already rising sense of anger. Marissa. That is one name I hated more than anything. If given a chance, I would have unalived her 2 years ago. I only left her because of her relationship with our boss, which was a big mistake. So, what you're saying is that you sold me out over the secret everyone knows? I gritted my teeth as I asked. Everyone knows? He looked at me in confusion. All of us ex-members know that you, Pedro, and Carl killed Jeffrey over some drug business, just like how you did with Boss. His eyes grew more prominent as I mentioned our dead boss. I guess he didn't expect this. We know this because the only member who got addicted to that new drug besides the boss was Luis. As he saw me taking out my gloves and wearing them, he started panicking and begging for mercy. I looked him in the eyes as I grabbed his throat before putting his gun under his chin and shooting his brains out. Blood gushed out from the other end of his head, and I released him, leaving his lifeless body to fall with a thud on the ground. Diego was the boss of the gang I was involved in before meeting Samantha. While it was non-existent to others because of our utmost secrecy and carefulness, we were engaged in some nasty shits back then. We had a girlfriend named Marissa, who used to think we were some local biker gang, since it was the cover we used to use to hide. She was a real whore, as she had slept with most members behind Boss's back, including Luis. I don't know what Diego saw in her to continue being with her despite probably knowing about her sleeping around. She tried to seduce me too, but I only felt disgust from her presence. That day, we went to the local Ojos Locos bar, where I first saw Samantha working as a server. I couldn't take my eyes off her, and for some reason I didn't particularly appreciate how others looked at her like hungry hyenas. I approached her and asked if I could have her number, which she outright refused, saying she didn't like mixing personal and professional life. And I was impressed that she wasn't willing to share her number with any men. My visits to that bar grew only to see her, and finally one day when she got out after work, I once again mustered up the courage to ask her out. It did take lots of effort to win her, but I eventually did and we started dating. I learned that she was orphaned at 5, had lived in foster care most of her life, and was currently sharing an apartment with 2 other girls. She couldn't receive proper education, and worked at Ojos Locos due to financial troubles. I asked her to move in with me, and we started living together. When she asked me to leave bad things, I couldn't refuse her. I planned on doing that anyway, since Diego got addicted to drugs. Being second in command, I knew my absence would break the gang, but I decided to do it either way. I planned on proposing to her right after telling Diego I was leaving, but as I got to the bar, I heard voices coming from a nearby alley. To my vexation, Marissa had grabbed Samantha by her hair and was saying something. She whispered something in response that ticked Marissa off, and as she was about to hit her, I grabbed her neck and slapped her across the face, before dragging her to Diego's place. "Have your slut under control before someone ends her life," He looked at me in confusion as I threw her at him. Despite being in control, he still never dared to go against me, since I was one of the best fighters he had known. And he knew I meant what I said. Samantha didn't wish to work after getting married, and I respected her wishes, since I was more than happy to provide for us. We got married within 2 months, and with her connections, she helped me get a security job in the same bar she used to work. We were happy with our lives until that little shit decided she could mess with my life and thought she could get away with it. I took Luis's cell before exiting Jeffrey's house. Rummaging through his cell phone, I learned where Jose was hiding. As I entered the warehouse by the woods, I found him unclad, behind Marissa, as she moaned on all fours. They dared to seek satisfaction after destroying my happiness and killing my baby. I felt like my nerves would pop any second at how infuriated I was. The perplexed look on their faces was laughable when I started thrashing Jose before they could finish. She got up to flee when she could grasp the situation, but I shot her in the legs. I realized I might end up in jail when all this would be over, but the rage was so in my head that I couldn't think straight. They had awakened the monster in me, and now they needed to face the consequences. After taking my sweet time, rearranging Jose's face and a few bones, I dragged him to the chair and tied him to it. I then shifted my attention to the trembling tramp and grabbed whatever I could use as a weapon, since I wanted to hear her beg for mercy for what she did. But to my disappointment, she couldn't even handle a single blow to her head and passed out. It had been a while since I tortured someone, so that I couldn't think of a technique. But then I remembered what I saw when I first walked in, so I made her sit on Jose's lap and tied them together. I scanned the area to find something useful when my eyes landed on the pipe wrench and a few other plumbing tools. How convenient. An evil, monstrous thought flashed through my mind, covering all my senses to reason. The torture I used to bring out information back then was nowhere near compared to what I would do with them.
Having toiled without rest for an eternity, I realized I was on the brink of burnout and desperately needed a break from all the stress. I approached my manager, David Halter, and asked for a 4-day leave. Despite never taking a break in the last 2 years, I was hopeful that he would understand my situation and grant me the request. David was a middle-aged man in his late 50s. His response took me aback when I finally mustered the courage to approach him with my request. He approved my leave application and gave me a 7-day stay pass to the 12 Apostles Hotel and Spa, a luxurious resort above the Atlantic Ocean. The thought of being surrounded by the ocean's soothing sound and the coastline's picturesque view was exhilarating. I could feel the excitement building up inside me as I imagined myself lounging on the beach, sipping a refreshing cocktail, and watching the sunset over the horizon. I was grateful for the opportunity to take a well-deserved break and recharge my batteries. I couldn't wait to pack my bags and embark on this much-needed vacation. When I arrived home, I contacted KLM customer service to book a round-trip flight from Bogota to Cape Town. On my return, I chose a Thursday to Sunday night flight and opted for business class on my outbound journey and premium economy. Despite the long flight, I was thrilled about the trip and decided to shop for all the necessary items beforehand. Finally, the day arrived, and I was ready to embark on my journey. Upon arrival in Cape Town, I spent the entire day in my hotel room, resting and preparing for the next day's tour. However, my peaceful slumber was abruptly cut short by a doorbell ringing in the middle of the night. I begrudgingly got out of bed to answer the door, only to be met by a member of the hotel staff holding a package. He claimed that it was for someone in the name of Bella Washer. I was shocked to hear my name, since I hadn't mentioned my trip to anyone and didn't know anyone in Cape Town. I tried explaining to the staff member that he had the wrong person, but he just nodded and left, leaving me uneasy and curious about the mysterious package. As I put the innocuous box on my bedside table, I felt a sense of unease wash over me. A nameless entity had sent it to me, and the thought of receiving something from someone I didn't know was enough to make my skin crawl. I sat next to it for 2 hours, trying to ignore it, but my curiosity eventually got the better of me. I mustered up the courage to open it, and inside I found a stunning bouquet and velvet card. However, when I looked at the card, I realized no writing was on it, a strange and alarming fact. I couldn't shake the feeling of being stalked by someone. The entire night was spent tossing and turning, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day, I approached the receptionist and inquired about the mysterious gift sender, but they had no clue who it could be. The delivery guy had dropped it off and left without saying anything. I spent hours worrying about who could have sent the gift and why, but I eventually decided to let it go to enjoy my vacation. After my long day of exploring the city of Cape Town, I returned to my hotel room and felt the need to freshen up. I turned on the faucet and let the warm water cascade over my body, washing away the day's grime and exhaustion. Feeling rejuvenated, I went to sleep. The next day, I woke up early, got dressed, and set out for another adventure, taking in the sights and sounds of the city. However, as I walked down the vibrant streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I looked around, but saw no one suspicious, just a few people walking by. I wondered if I was being paranoid after that night's unsettling encounter. Nevertheless, I decided to keep my guard up and continued my tour. As the sun began to set, I found myself at a bar and decided to have some drinks. Walking in, I noticed 3 men following me and checking me out. I tried to ignore them and ordered 3 vodka shots, downing them all in one go. As I sipped on my drink, I couldn't help but feel like someone was watching me. Turning my head, I caught the gaze of one of the guys who had entered the bar with me. He was staring at me intently, and when he realized I had noticed him, he flashed me a smile and started walking over to me. Despite his friendly demeanor, I politely declined his offer to join me. I was on this vacation to enjoy some time alone, away from male distractions. My past experiences had taught me that I needed to be cautious around men. A little while later, another guy approached me and asked me for a dance. Once again, I declined, preferring instead to focus on my drink. As the night wore on, I started to feel a little tipsy, so I decided to call it a night and head back to my hotel room. I don't remember much about how I got there, but when I woke up the following day, I was still wearing the dress I had on the previous night, and my head was pounding. I got up, feeling frustrated, but I was still ready to start the day. After a long shower, I got dressed and went to explore the local market area. My primary purpose for today was to shop, and I was excited to see what the market offered. While browsing through some beautiful jewelry pieces, I noticed the same group of guys from last night walking around the area. I couldn't help but feel suspicious of them, especially after the strange gift I received that night. Frustrated by the situation, I decided to head back to my hotel room, where I could relax and enjoy some of the hotel's amenities. However, as soon as I entered my room, I received a call from reception, informing me that another parcel was in my name. I was curious about the sender, but the receptionist knew nothing about it. After a few minutes, there was a knock on my door, and I found the parcel sitting on the floor. I scanned the area to see if anyone was watching me, but there was no one. I picked up the box and examined it. It was wrapped beautifully, and there was no indication of who sent it. I couldn't resist the urge to open it, and as I did, I found a blank note, a beautiful necklace, and a white rose inside. To my surprise, it was the same necklace I had admired in the jewelry store earlier. Feeling frustrated and confused, I returned to the store and investigated. I wanted to know who sent me the necklace and why. When I got to the jewelry store, they mentioned a blonde guy named Derry Pecker. They didn't want to disclose his details, but after I requested them for a while, they provided me with his contact details. I returned to the hotel room and sat on my bed while staring at my phone, wondering if I should call him. Finally, I pressed his number on the dial pad and put the cell phone to my ear. After the third ring, a guy with a husky voice picked up the call. I shuddered with horror as he spoke my name and said he knew who I was and where I was calling from. When I asked Derry if he had sent me the previous gift, he didn't deny it. Instead, he confessed that he had fallen for me at first sight and wanted to shower me with as many gifts as possible. Although his familiarity with me was unnerving, I tried my best not to show it. But then he asked to meet me in person. I felt incredibly skeptical of his intentions and decided to use this opportunity to discover who he was and what he wanted from me. I didn't believe a word he said. I made a mental note to call 911 if anything went wrong before agreeing to meet him. To my horror, he revealed that he was staying in the same hotel as me, in the room next to mine. The whole situation felt beyond creepy, and I knew I needed to tell someone if things went wrong. The only person I could think of was my friend Beck. I immediately called her and recounted every detail of what had happened up to that point. Beck's response was less than reassuring. She acknowledged that it seemed suspicious, but suggested that maybe Derry was just a nice guy with genuine intentions. She advised me to kick him to the curb and run if he tried anything weird. While I appreciated her attempt at comforting me, her advice wasn't very helpful. After talking to her for a while, I disconnected the call, feeling more anxious than ever. Derry and I had planned to meet at 8 p.m., so I had a couple of hours to prepare. I decided to pamper myself and warmly shower to relieve the day's fatigue. After drying my hair, I carefully curled it into loose, bouncy waves. I then put on a lavender mid-length dress that beautifully hugged my curves and paired it with elegant silver heels, adding sophistication to the ensemble. For my makeup, I went for a natural look, with a hint of glossy lipstick and a light peach blush that perfectly accentuated my facial features. Finally, I spritzed on a lavender-scented perfume. As I prepared to leave my cozy hotel room, my phone rang, and I noticed an unknown number flashing on the screen. I hesitated before answering, but my curiosity got the better of me. A man on the other end spoke, panicked, and asked me to leave the hotel room immediately. I followed his instructions, thinking it could be urgent, and as I stepped out, I noticed a flashy red Ferrari parked outside the hotel gate. 2 men were standing beside it, and I immediately recognized them as the same 2 men I had seen that day at the bar. My heart started racing in nervousness as I realized it could be Derry, whom I was supposed to meet. The men beckoned me to get into the car, and I hesitated momentarily before deciding to play along. thinking that it was all part of Derry's plan. I got inside the car, and as the door closed behind me, I noticed that the interior was luxurious and smelled of leather, but my curiosity quickly turned into fear when I asked about Derry's whereabouts, and they replied with confusion, "Who's Derry? You're mistaken. We don't know anyone by that name." As I reminded the two men about the third guy, I noticed a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. But the next thing they said caught me off guard. "3? What are you talking about? It was always just the two of us." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They told me that in the bar and in the market, that it was just the two of them. They tried to jog my memory about what had happened that night, how I had given them my number and agreed to hang out with them during my visit. That was why they had come to pick me up, so we could all hang out. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't recall any of it. I started to feel uneasy and decided to call Derry's number to clarify things. However, the line wasn't connecting, and my head throbbed. I told the guys I wasn't feeling well and got out of the car. I couldn't shake off the suspicion that something was off. I was sure I had seen 3 guys, and their denial didn't make sense. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that there had to be a reasonable explanation for what was happening. I had to find out the truth of the matter, so I returned to the jewelry store and insisted that they tell me who the sender of that necklace was. They continued saying it was Derry, but as I was about to give up, I noticed a hesitation on their face. I realized they were hiding something. That was when I got an idea and told them I was being harassed by the person who sent it to me. I said that I would report it to the police, and then they would have to come clean no matter what. Their faces went pale, and they immediately handed me the contact information of a guy while apologizing. They told me he wanted his information to be private, so they shared the wrong information earlier. As I started dialing that number, I was surprised to see that I already had it, and there were calls made on that number from mine a few times. It was weird that I did not remember calling anyone ever. When I called him, I was surprised when he asked if there was another gift I wanted him to deliver. My eyes widened in horror as I stared at my phone for a few minutes before asking what he meant by that. I couldn't believe my ears when he told me I hired him to purchase gifts and send them in my name. Feeling panicked, I abruptly disconnected the call, for I couldn't bear hearing his lies. I immediately ran to the police station and told them everything. They investigated the matter, revealing something even more terrifying and confusing. The conversation between me and Derry never existed. That number was wrong, and I was never able to contact him. As the officer overseeing my case looked at me in pity, I couldn't help but flinch. He suggested I go to a psychiatrist and see if something was wrong with me. I returned to the hotel room with a disturbed mind, and I lay on my bed and recalled everything. So many things in my story weren't making sense to me. I started doubting if something was wrong with me. I returned to Bogota on the scheduled date, and upon deciding to heed that officer's advice, I scheduled an appointment for myself. So here I am, standing outside the hospital, debating if I should go inside, for I'm terrified as hell for whatever diagnosis they will be making. Everything I had been through for all these years, being crazy, is the one thing I never imagined I would have to worry about. I can't understand why I can't say anything. What powerful force is this that is so frightening? James thought in his mind. Finally, he was talking about a terrifying power. This is a story that James and his brother Henry can never forget. It was those days when James and Henry both went to college together. and their ages were also the same. In their class, there was a girl named Elizabeth who was very beautiful and everyone's favorite friend. Whatever was in her attracted anyone who saw her. I don't know why, James said. Henry, I've been waiting for you for so long. I've made these sweets for you, Elizabeth said to Henry. In reality, Elizabeth and Henry were quite good friends. They always stayed together, and their friendship was known throughout the college. But for some reason, James didn't like this friendship. Elizabeth always wore full-sleeve tops. One day, alone in a dark room, Elizabeth raised the sleeves of her hands. And what is this? Bloodstains on her hands and large marks cut with a knife, James said in a startled voice from a distance. Who was Elizabeth after all? It was 1 a.m., and at that moment, Henry received a call. Half asleep, Henry said, "Hey, Auntie, why did you call so late? Is Elizabeth okay?" Hearing this, James also woke up. Today is a very auspicious day. Quickly come to our house, which is situated near the cemetery. Elizabeth is waiting for you, Elizabeth's mother said to the two brothers on the call. But it was 1 a.m., and the two brothers couldn't understand why Elizabeth's mother was calling them at such a late hour. The two brothers ignored her calls and went back to sleep. The next morning, seeing numerous missed calls from Elizabeth's mother, both of them were surprised. On the other hand, as soon as they went to college, Elizabeth met them and informed that there will be some rituals at her home tomorrow morning, and she wants both brothers to come along. Without thinking much, the two brothers readily agreed to go to her house. The next morning, the two brothers set out for Elizabeth's house. Little did they know, her house was quite far from the city, nestled amidst dark woods, near the cemetery. Yes, that house was situated near a deserted cemetery, which was a bit spooky. But without any inspection or examination, the two brothers reached her house. Not only this, in that deserted cemetery, James saw a lady who must have been around 50 years old performing some ritual. Even after seeing this, he ignored it, and they thought to enter into the house. "Oh, what's this?" "To enter the house, we have to cross 3 gates in front," James said. "I've never seen such a house before," he added. James wanted to stop his brother Henry from going further, but for some reason, a force seemed to be pulling both of them towards the house. Without thinking, they entered the house after crossing the gates. "Wait a minute, dear. Enter with your left foot," Elizabeth's mother instructed the two brothers. The room was filled with darkness where sunlight couldn't penetrate because all the windows of the house were covered with black cloth. Seeing this, both brothers found it strange, but they silently entered the room. Then Elizabeth came and took James with her to the garden on the terrace. On the other hand, her mother took Henry to a nearby room where a prayer ceremony was about to take place. There were several small plants placed on the terrace, all of which were dead, except for one plant with a hanging flower. Elizabeth asked James to pluck that flower, and suddenly, at that moment, that plant died within a second. Then both went together into the prayer room, where Elizabeth's mother and Henry were already standing. In that room, there was a strange black statue, which looked quite eerie. Suddenly, a handicapped boy, who seemed like a dead body out of the graveyard, was brought into the room, and candles for the prayer were placed in his hands. After that, Elizabeth's mother began the prayer. By observing everything, James realized that what was happening in that room was not an ordinary prayer. Rather, it was a worship of some evil entity, perhaps a demonic ritual. At that moment, James realized that what he saw in the cemetery before entering into the house, that same lady was actually Elizabeth's mother. On the other hand, Henry seemed bound by some force, lacking the ability to speak or escape. At that moment, James grabbed his brother Henry's hand and ran away from there. Finally, they reached an old church far away from that house, and after that, both of them were safe. Relieved to find solace in the ancient church, James and Henry tried to make sense of the eerie events they had just experienced. As they contemplated, a call from their mother interrupted their thoughts. She was anxious, had a disturbing dream where she dreamed of Jesus reassuring her that he had saved their son, but cautioned against repeating the same mistake. The brothers hesitated, but eventually explained the strange occurrences at Elizabeth's house, revealing the unsettling rituals and the mysterious force that seemed to envelope Henry. Their mother, worried yet grateful for the divine intervention in her dream, urged them to stay away from such unknown and potentially dangerous situations. As the family reconnected at home, they decided to consult the father of church for guidance. In a subsequent visit to their spiritual mentor, they found out that the strange ceremonies at Elizabeth's house were connected to the revival of a dead body at the cemetery, and Henry had unintentionally become entangled in their harmful activities. Grateful for their safety, the family pledged to strengthen their spiritual bond and uphold the teachings of Jesus' path. The unsettling episode became a pivotal moment for James and Henry, reinforcing the importance of discernment and the guidance of divine forces in their lives. In the aftermath of the unsettling events, the family embraced a newfound understanding of spirituality and discernment. Their mother's dream served as a wake-up call, prompting them to reflect on the importance of heeding divine guidance and staying away from potentially harmful situations.
Hello? Yeah, Mom, I just got here. Yeah, don't worry. I booked an Uber. Okay. Don't worry. I'll share my live location. As soon as I landed in Ohio to visit my grandparents, my mother called me all worried because it was the first time that I was traveling alone. I mean, come on, Mom needs to take it easy. I know it's my first time traveling to another state, but I used to travel alone in my hometown all the time. So as I told my mom I'd already booked myself a ride that was supposed to be there any minute, I checked again on the Uber app and it said, "Sorry, your ride might be delayed due to some inconvenience from our side." I checked the time and it was 11:49 p.m. I thought it'd be best to wait till the ride arrived, so I sat down on an empty bench in front of the airport. As I was waiting for the Uber, I noticed two drunk guys passing by and turning over in my direction. I got scared by the thought of them molesting me, so I immediately got up and started walking in the opposite direction. At the same time, I saw the Uber car stop in front of me. I double-checked, and it was my ride, so I immediately got in. "Are you okay, ma'am?" The driver noticed me all panicked, so he asked. "Yes, I'm fine. Don't worry. Just drive me to the destination, please." I replied with a bit of a cold tone, which he sensed and started driving. The rest of the ride, he was completely silent. There was something that I noticed in his car, and it was the faint smell of blood. How did I notice this even though it was faint? Well, I work in a hospital as a nurse, so I come across blood all the time. That's how I easily recognized it. It felt a bit creepy and weird to me, so I kept thinking about all the possibilities of the blood spilling in his car. There was this possibility that he may have gotten hurt or made an accident while driving, or he was a serial killer who could have killed someone in the car. As I was thinking all this, the car stopped and the driver told me that we have reached our destination. I absentmindedly got off and walked into my grandparents' house. He drove off and I thought that it must be my imagination because working in a hospital and always being around blood had made my nose sensitive. I thought of calling my mom and informing her about my arrival, but then I realized that my purse was missing. Even after looking for it through everything, my stuff and all, I could not find it. Now, there was only one possibility that I left my purse inside the cab, and I had no way to contact the driver because I remember putting my phone inside my purse when I was getting in the car, and the driver's details were inside the car as well. It was not just my phone that was inside the car, my credit cards, my passport, and my other identification cards, every important stuff that was in that purse. My grandfather told me that he would try to do something about it and left. Well, my grandmother asked me not to worry and presented side dishes and sweets for me to eat. I had no appetite left to eat anything, but I still ate some, just so that she would not feel bad. Since I did not know much about the town, I had no other choice but to wait for Grandpa to come back. He returned around 4 in the evening and told me that he had reported the police about it, and that they would find it. I knew deep down that it would be no use, and started thinking that I should just forget about my things. I informed Mom about my arrival and my purse being missing, to Grandpa's phone, for which she scolded me to her heart's content. Grandma cooked a nice dinner for us that night, chicken and everything. I thought my purse was gone anyway, so why should I miss out on Grandma's cooking? I ate till my belly started to feel tighten. Trust me, Grandma's cooking is the best, which I could eat without limits. After dinner, she brought dessert, and then I had that. After eating, she guided me upstairs to a room that had an outside view. I opened the window, looked outside, and noticed a car parked in front of Grandma's house. A man was standing outside the car and looking in the direction of our house. I instantly recognized him, and he was the Uber driver. I immediately ran out while Grandma followed me. As I reached the driver, took out a bag and handed it to me. As I was thanking him, I realized the smell of blood was stronger than before. I know I shouldn't think of such a thing at a moment like this, but I still couldn't avoid it. I was thankful for the driver's honesty and the fact that he came back to return my purse to me. The next day, I was playing with Aunt Freya's daughter, and my grandparents were watching the news. Grandma called me to show me something. I walked there and looked in the direction of the television, where she pointed a finger. The news was broadcasting about an Uber driver going off and killing rapists. I recognized him by the picture. I finally understood the reason behind the blood smell in this car. He was arrested and the investigation was going on. So we followed and continued watching the news for the next few days. It was revealed that he was a single father of a 7-year-old beautiful daughter and earned a living by driving for Uber. One day when he had left his daughter with a nanny and was at work, the nanny along with her daughter were gang raped and murdered. When he returned, he found a very disturbing sight of their bodies, which made him tremble and angry to his core. He reported the case to the police, but the police were unable to find the culprits behind the crime. So he decided to take the matters into his own hands and went on a killing spree against the rapists. He'd killed more than 8 people who had raped infants, young women, and elderly ladies. I saw the final news before my departure from my grandparents' house. He was being held on trial and that the murder of his daughter and the nanny were being investigated. One thought that crossed my mind, even though it is not right by law, was, I wish more people like him emerge and kill the inhumane beings and monsters of our lives.
The storm. On the morning of my first day working on a cruise ship, the excitement that had been building inside me for weeks reached its peak. I could hardly contain my enthusiasm as I made my way to the ship, my heart pounding with anticipation. The sight of the vast, sparkling ocean stretched out before me was like a dream come true, and I felt a sense of awe at the sheer grandeur of it all. I had worked tirelessly to get to this point, overcoming countless challenges and obstacles along the way, but now, as I stepped aboard the ship and took my surroundings, I knew that all that hard work had been worth it. The feeling of accomplishment was indescribable, and I felt a surge of pride at having achieved my lifelong dream. My love for water was something that I had developed purely on my own. None of my family members had ever worked in the maritime industry, and my grandpa even had a water phobia. However, I was different. I had always been fascinated with water. Watching documentaries and listening to people's stories about their experiences on the open sea only fueled my desire to explore the vast blue waters myself. As I stepped onto the ship, the salty scent of the ocean filled my nostrils. The sounds of the waves crashing against the hull was music to my ears. However, I started feeling seasickness as the ship went deeper into the water. It was probably because of the tuna sandwiches I ate before coming on board. Still, it wasn't that bad, and I knew it would go away after a while. Time passed quickly on the ship, and while not everyone was friendly, I managed to make a few friends who shared my love for water. On the 5th day, around 2 a.m., I was working in the bar area when the announcement came. A massive storm was approaching, and we were instructed to take shelter in our rooms. Everyone started to act immediately as panic erupted, and my heart pounded as I rushed back to my cabin. Violent waves buffeted the ship, and the sound of the wind howling outside was deafening. I prayed that the ship would be strong enough to weather this storm. My heart was beating uncontrollably as I watched the wind was cruel as it battered the ship, threatening to tear it apart. The waves were just as monstrous, rising and falling in a relentless assault that seemed capable of swallowing us whole. As the storm continued to rage on, the ship was tossed around like a mere toy in the hands of a giant. The sheer horror of this situation was palpable, as each one of us aboard trembled in fear. The sounds of things breaking and crashing could be heard with the storm's voice, a deafening roar that seemed to consume everything in its path. Amidst the chaos, there were faint screams of people coming from all sides, adding to the already terrifying atmosphere. As a staff member, I felt helpless and scared, unable to muster the courage to check on them. I know it was selfish of me, but I couldn't care less about others, knowing that my own life was at stake. I had been huddled in my room for hours, listening to the howling winds and crashing waves. Finally, the storm subsided, and I cautiously stepped out onto the hallway. The ship was in shambles. Broken furniture and personal belongings were strewn about, and the walls were scuffed and scratched. As I made my way to the upper deck, I saw that the damage was even worse outside. The deck was littered with debris, pieces of metal, shattered glass, people's vomit, and torn canvas. As I made my way through the wreckage, I noticed many injured people and a few casualties, including 3 of my new friends. It was a heart-wrenching sight that I'll never forget. After what felt like an eternity, help finally arrived, but it took more than an hour for the rescue team to reach us. They immediately started taking care of the injured and transporting them to a nearby coast. I remembered sitting in the corner of the deck when women and children were rescued first. It was a chaotic and emotional scene, with people crying and screaming for help. When it was finally my turn, everything felt still unreal, as if it was a nightmare. My heart was pounding so hard that it took me a moment to realize that I was being rescued. It almost felt like a miracle that I had survived the ordeal. Luckily, I was one of the ones who managed to escape with just a few bruises and scrapes, but the experience left me shaken to my core. As I sat on the rescue boat, I couldn't help but think about how lucky I was to be intact while many lost their loved ones. I'd always dreamed of working on a ship, but now I realized that life on the sea was not all sunsets and calm waters. We made our way back to shore, and I knew that my time on the ship was coming to an end. I had seen and experienced too much, and I knew that I could never go back to it. It was a bittersweet feeling. On the one hand, I was sad to leave behind my dream job and the friends I'd made. On the other hand, I was grateful to be alive. As I stood on the shore, watching the chaos unfold before me, ambulances rushed back and forth, sirens blaring. As they transported injured individuals to the nearest hospital, the once calm and inviting ocean now looked like a menacing force, unleashing its fury upon anyone who dared to enter its domain. At that moment, I realized that my life held far more value than any dream job ever could. I couldn't bear the thought of putting myself in harm's way just for the sake of a paycheck. Don't get me wrong, I still loved the water and all of its beauty, but the sight of the ocean's wrath instilled a sense of fear in me that couldn't be ignored.
Around the cemetery. There was an old cemetery in a place with hills and dense woods. It was not just a resting place for the departed, but also a place full of stories and memories. This cemetery was special,
holding the history of the town and the lives once lived there. When the sun set, the gravestones cast long shadows, and the cemetery seemed to wake up with a silent energy. Tom, a curious teenager who loved adventures, was often attracted to the cemetery. His friends warned him about the spooky atmosphere and stories of restless spirits, but Tom wasn't scared. He believed that the answers to the town's mysteries were hidden in the tales written on the worn tombstones. One dark afternoon, when the sky was covered with heavy clouds, Tom decided to finally explore the cemetery. As he went through the creaky gates, he felt a strange coldness in the air. Ignoring it, he walked on the narrow paths lined with old oak trees that stood like silent guards. The gravestones had the names of the town's founders, who built a life in the wild land. Tom ran his fingers over the writings, feeling the cool touch of the engraved words. Each name had a story of love, of sadness, of success, and of course, sorrow. Tom found an old mausoleum under a big willow tree. The stone walls looked old and had stories from a long time ago. Tom bravely opened the creaky door and went inside, feeling like he was stepping back in time. When Tom opened the door, a dusty smell came out, and it smelled like those old times. Inside, the dim light showed many crypts in rows. Each one had been there for a long time. Tom could feel the history in the air, connecting to the stories written on the stones. While looking around inside the dark, Tom found something surprising. A dusty old book tucked away in a quiet corner. The cover looked old and hinted that there might be something special inside. As he carefully opened the pages, now yellow with age, he got lost in stories written by hand, telling the interesting history of Willow Creek. One story caught Tom's attention: the tale of Emily Turner, a young woman who had a sad end in the late 1800s. The writings told of a love that was not returned, a heart that was broken, and an early departure from the world. Tom was intrigued, feeling a connection to Emily's story, as if her spirit lingered in the air around him. With a newfound purpose, Tom set out to uncover the truth behind Emily Turner's early death. He talked to older town residents, searched through old records, and retraced the steps of the past. As he gathered the puzzle pieces, he found a story of love hindered by society's rules and a young woman's strength in tough times. Tom started going to the cemetery to visit Emily Turner's grave. He would sit beside it, telling stories and asking for advice. The longer he stayed, the more he felt a connection to the spirits. It seemed like the souls at rest found comfort in Tom's company, and the old stories turned into a gentle murmur that stayed with him during his journeys. One night, with the moon shining bright, Tom sat beside Emily's grave in the cemetery. A gentle glow surrounded the area, and the air seemed to shimmer with a magical light. To Tom's surprise, a see-through figure appeared. It was Emily Turner herself. Her eyes showed both sadness and gratitude as she spoke to Tom and told the story behind her death. Tom listened closely as Emily shared her memories, dreams, and the pain that kept her tied to the earthly world. In that surreal moment, a connection formed between the living and the departed, going beyond the limits of time and space. One day, as Tom sat by Emily's grave, he felt a subtle presence, and then he heard a faint voice. It was Emily's spirit. She shared with Tom the tragic story of her murder by her boyfriend. Tom, determined to seek justice, asked Emily if she knew where he could find a witness. Emily's spirit guided Tom to an old neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, who had seen the incident unfold. With newfound determination, Tom visited Mrs. Johnson and learned about the events leading to Emily's untimely death. Armed with this information, Tom decided to take the evidence to the authorities to bring Emily's boyfriend to justice and finally bring peace to her restless spirit. The last time when he met the spirit of Emily as dawn approached, Emily's figure started to fade, but not before leaving a message of hope and closure. She encouraged Tom to share her story with the world, showing that love, even when hindered by circumstances, could last beyond life. With a new sense of purpose, Tom worked to honor Emily's legacy. He wrote articles, organized community events, and shared the story of Willows Creek Cemetery with anyone willing to listen. The town, once wrapped in the shadows of forgotten stories, began to embrace its history and the spirits lingering on the cemetery's sacred grounds. As time went on, Willow Creek Cemetery changed from a place of whispers and darkness to a symbol of remembrance. People visited not because they were scared, but because they wanted to connect with the spirits that had shaped the town. The spirits, no longer burdened by untold stories, found peace as the living embraced the legacy they left behind. The small town of Willow Creek continued to thrive, and its cemetery became a living reminder of the power of stories, the strength of love, and the lasting bond between the living and departed. As the years passed, the cemetery's story became a cherished part of the town's identity. Families would come to visit their ancestors' resting places, sharing stories and laughter under the shade of old oak trees. The cemetery, once a mysterious and solitary place, now echoed with the warmth of community and the enduring spirit of those who had lived before.
There used to work a girl named Olivia, and the two of us became pretty close after some time. She had an easygoing personality, but whenever I was with her, I felt a bit insecure about her. Still, I never let it show. Unlike my parents, hers supported her decision to work at Tilted Kilt, and being the family's youngest child, she was spoiled like no other. Even her boyfriend was the guy every girl wished to be with. When I told her I was looking for a cheap apartment because my parents kicked me out, she offered to help and moved in with me. Her sharing half of the rent did ease my financial trouble, making me feel grateful to her. Despite my jealousy, I still liked her. She was kind. One day, out of the blue, she told me that she had broken up with her boyfriend, Fred, and had started seeing someone else. I couldn't understand why she would do that, but I soon discovered it was because she had witnessed him cheating. So, out of desolation, she slept with a man she met at the bar. I don't know if it was because of my envy or something else, and I know it was wrong of me to feel that way, but I was somewhat satisfied, watching her screw up like the rest of us. She told me it was a one-night stand or something. But it wasn't long before someone started to send her flowers with romantic notes on them. She was pretty much annoyed by him, who continued sending her expensive gifts to woo her, and finally, one day, out of frustration, she decided to meet the man to give him an outright rejection. I thought she would return with the news that she told him off. But that night, when she didn't return to the apartment, I knew it was not the case anymore. Slowly, she started cutting off her shift short and would often get scolded by the manager for coming late and skipping work. But it was like she didn't care about the job anymore. I was also in a relationship then, but the guy I was dating started to avoid me suddenly, so I used to get irritated easily. And the fact that the new guy was giving her such expensive gifts while my boyfriend didn't even acknowledge my existence anymore made my hackles rise. She even started to spend most of her nights at his place, and one day, out of the blue, she quit work. I shouldn't have felt bothered, but I was worried about her, since I knew she wasn't the kind of girl who would stop working just because of some boy. And the fact that I had never seen that man was even more worrisome. It made me anxious. like something very wrong was going on. A few days passed, and I decided it was none of my business what she did with her life, so I stopped thinking about it. But then, when I went to surprise my boyfriend, Matt, I found his apartment locked from the outside. My spare key wasn't working either, meaning he changed it recently. I didn't want our relationship to end because no spark was left anymore. I tried to put an effort before giving up on us, which was why I was here today. But this stunt of his felt like he was telling me it was over between us. But as I was about to leave, I heard a muffled sound coming from inside the apartment. It almost felt as if someone was locked and in pain. So I tried calling Matt, but he didn't answer. After fretting over what to do, I concluded that I should call 911 and tell them about the situation. When the cops arrived and broke the lock, what I witnessed was genuinely horrifying, which added to my distress, as I saw the girl tied in the chair in such a terrible state was none other than Olivia. When she saw me, she burst into tears and continued repeating the same sentence. "I'm sorry. I didn't know then." I wanted to be angry at her. After all, I had always felt envious of her, but for some reason, all I felt was pity. It was evident by the bruises and wounds all over her body that she was indecently assaulted, and judging by the condition of her injuries, it wasn't just once or twice. I got a picture of what could have happened here and that the man she told me about must be Matt. Guess that was why he was distancing himself from me. I heard her side of the story when she told the cops everything. The day she went to reject him, he used his manipulation skills on her and convinced her that he could make her happy more than her ex ever did. As heartbroken as she was, she needed something to fill the gap in her heart, so she started seeing him. He slowly became controlling and possessive, and even made her quit her job at Tilted Kilt. But one day she saw my incoming call on his cell phone. When confronted, Matt lied that it was his ex-girlfriend, who was still clingy. But since she had already heard from me about my boyfriend and had often seen me talking to him, she instantly knew he was lying. She made a mistake when she told him she knew me and that he was lying. So before she could walk out on him, he grabbed her by her hair and dragged her inside, only to lock her inside his apartment. He started mistreating and beating her whenever she tried to escape, and she began to lose hope that she would be able to get away from him. But luckily, I decided to visit the bastard. In my mind, she had always been a frenemy to me, the girl I cared about but secretly hated some things about her. Even then, I sometimes felt proud that I was acquainted with her. And if someone were to tell my past self that one day I would feel rage for her instead, I know she wouldn't believe me. But right now, as sympathetic as I was to her, I wanted to find that son of a bitch and kill him. But the police were already on his trail. He was arrested 3 days after Olivia was found captive in his apartment, and after a few trials, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for everything he did to her. The permanent scar and the trauma he had given her were much greater than the punishment he received, but it was still better that he was locked up. She continued apologizing to me until the end, without knowing that by mistakenly taking it upon herself, she saved me from something that could have been my fate, and for that, I will always be the one who is grateful to her.
The town of Fanville was excited because they were getting ready for the Minions Fan Festival. People from all over were looking forward to the big celebration. 3 friends, John, Emily, and Mike, were working hard to make sure this year's festival would be amazing. They gathered in their Minion-filled headquarters to plan everything. John was super excited and said, "This Minions Fan Festival is going to be the best." Emily, who loved Minions and played the ukulele, showed everyone a map of the parade route. "Listen up, fans! We're going to have the biggest Minions fan parade Fanville has ever seen." The organizers worked hard to get ready for the Minions Fan Festival. They turned their houses into Minion decorations and put up banners that looked like the characters. They even convinced the mayor to temporarily change the town's name to Minionville, just for the festival. When the festival started, Fanville became a happy and lively place. There was a big parade with a float called Minion Mania going through the streets. Fans dressed up like their favorite Minions characters and threw Minion-themed things at the crowd. Everyone was laughing and cheering, and you could hear the funny giggles of the Minions in the air. Amidst all the happiness, a sudden and loud noise disrupted the festive mood. It was a shocking bomb blast that echoed through the town, instantly turning the Minions Fan Festival into a chaotic and frightening scene. The unexpected explosion cast a dark shadow over Fanville, leaving everyone in a state of panic. The joyful cheers turned into screams of fear as people realized something had gone wrong. The streets, once filled with laughter and excitement, now became a frantic scramble of frightened festival goers. The colorful Minion decorations and banners that had adorned the town were now overshadowed by the grim reality of the situation. Amid the chaos, some people were injured, adding to the overall sense of terror. The crowd, initially gathered to celebrate, is now dispersed in every direction, desperately trying to find safety. The once well-organized parade route became a maze of panicked individuals running in fear and confusion. The Minion-themed goodies that had been joyfully tossed into the crowd were now forgotten, as people focused on escaping the unexpected danger. The sounds of laughter were replaced by the sirens of emergency vehicles rushing to the scene. The organizers, John, Emily, and Mike, were among those shocked and scared. Their faces went from excitement to disbelief, and then quickly turned to concern for the safety of the festival goers. They too became part of the crowd trying to navigate the tumultuous situation. In the aftermath of the blast, the Minions Fan Festival, once filled with anticipation and joy, became a somber event marked by confusion and fear. The town that had temporarily become Minionville now faced a reality it never expected, as emergency services worked to restore order and attend to the injured. Suddenly, John, Emily, and Mike realized that something really bad had happened. They got together to figure out what was going on. John asked Emily, "Emily, what's happening?" He narrowly avoided some debris from the blast. Emily looked serious as she looked at all the chaos around them. She said, "It's an emergency. We need to stay safe and help others. Let's find out what happened." In the middle of all the confusion, the organizers became like leaders in the community. They started telling fans where to go to stay safe, helping out however they could, and taking charge of things. John grabbed his phone and quickly called the emergency services. He said, "We need help. There's been an explosion at the Minions Fan Festival. Send police and fire workers right away." Emergency services were called, and the town came together to show strength in the face of unexpected trouble. Fans helped each other, giving support and comfort. The Minions Fan Festival, which had been full of happiness and joy, was now a place where people stood together, showing unity in a tough situation. After John called for help, the ambulance was on its way. A few people had gotten hurt in the blast, but the community quickly stepped up to help. John, Emily, and Mike, along with other festival goers, took charge of the situation. They made sure to guide the injured to a safe place and comfort them as they waited for medical help. Some people used their festival shirts to make makeshift bandages, doing whatever they could to assist. Emily, with her ukulele in hand, began playing calming tunes to soothe the nerves of those around her. Mike organized a group to help clear away any obstacles and debris, making it safer for the emergency services to arrive. As the ambulance got closer, the fans formed a sort of human shield, helping to create a clear path for the paramedics. Once the medical team arrived, the community continued to support them by providing information about the injured and assisting in any way they could. Despite the initial shock and fear, the Minions Fan Festival attendees demonstrated remarkable resilience. They worked together, showing a sense of unity that went beyond the celebration they had planned. The festival may not have gone as expected, but the community spirit prevailed in the face of adversity. As things started to get better, John, Emily, and Mike worked with the police to figure out what happened. They found out that the blast was an accident, and it had nothing to do with the festival. It was caused by a problem at a nearby construction site. The people in Fanville felt a huge sense of relief, knowing that it wasn't a deliberate attack on their celebration. As the town slowly went back to normal, the Minions Fan Festival had a lasting impact on everyone. The organizers, who had taken charge during the tough times, were seen as heroes. To show appreciation, Fanville decided to start a new tradition called Fan Appreciation Day. This special day was all about celebrating how the community stayed together and stayed strong when faced with unexpected problems. Fanville, once filled with worry and chaos, now has a positive and united feeling. The Minions Fan Festival might not have gone the way they planned, but it brought the town together in a way they hadn't expected. The spirit of Fan Appreciation Day became a symbol of unity and strength for the people of Fanville. I was driving from Connecticut to my friend's place in West Virginia that day. The bastard was supposed to get engaged, and even though I didn't want to, I still had to attend his engagement ceremony since he practically threatened me to do so. I was well aware of the route since I had gone there quite a few times, so I had taken the familiar highway. I was cruising down the road, lost in my thoughts, when an unexpected pang of hunger hit me. I realized that the only thing I had eaten before heading out was a hamburger, and now I was starving. The road stretched out ahead of me, and I knew it would be hours before I came across another eatery. That's when I noticed an old and mysterious-looking restaurant on the side of the road. It was strange that I had never seen it before, but I still decided to go there. As I parked the car outside the restaurant, I saw a young boy, around 7 or 8 years old, playing with a ball. When he noticed me, he stopped and stared at me for a few seconds before running inside the restaurant. I followed him inside, only to find the place empty, except for a couple who seemed to own the restaurant, standing on the other side of the counter. The moment they saw me, they gave me an unnatural forced smile and welcomed me in unison. I was handed a menu and sat at one of the empty tables. As I perused the menu, I couldn't help but notice the eerie silence of the place. After a few minutes, I decided to go with a plate of spaghetti and a bottle of Coke. While I impatiently waited for my food, my eyes roamed around the restaurant, taking in the surroundings. Despite its age, the place was spotless, with no dust or dirt in sight. The vines growing on the counter of the roof were a beautiful sight, their leaves rustling gently in the breeze. The boy I had seen earlier was still lingering around, his eyes fixed on me with a mixture of curiosity and awe, as if I were a being from another world. His innocent gaze made me feel both uncomfortable and intrigued at the same time. As they brought the dish to my table, I couldn't help but ask how long the restaurant had been open, and their lips curved into a smile as they replied, "We have been here for a long time." Then they returned to the counter, where I had seen them standing when I entered. Feeling confused by the reply, I took a bite of the spaghetti. Unfortunately, I realized it was incredibly bland when it entered my mouth. Although I don't typically criticize food, the flavorless spaghetti disappointed me. I considered telling them about it, but I didn't want to hurt their feelings. After all, what could I expect from a restaurant in such a remote area? Thus, I quietly finished the dish and left the restaurant, feeling a bit underwhelmed by the experience. The plate of spaghetti I had was supposed to satisfy my hunger, but it left me feeling just as empty as I was feeling before. It was strange because I usually feel full after just a few bites. Despite this, I decided to continue my journey to my friend's place without eating anything else. I drove for 4 hours, passing through picturesque landscapes and scenic routes. Finally, I arrived at the engagement ceremony, where my friend Henry was waiting for me outside his house. His warm welcome made me forget all about my hunger. "How was the journey?" he asked. Nothing special, except for the worst spaghetti I've ever had on the way here," I replied, still feeling a bit queasy. "Where did you have it?" he asked curiously, raising an eyebrow. "Remember the highway where our car broke down once? There's an old restaurant nearby," I explained, hoping to jog his memory. "That's impossible. The area's deserted," he replied, looking perplexed. "I thought so too, but there's one at the side of the road. I'll show you someday," I said with a sense of adventure, excited to explore the area again. Maybe there were other places we never noticed besides that restaurant. We headed inside, ready to enjoy the engagement ceremony. After the ceremony ended, I decided to stop and visit Aunt Chloe before heading home. The drive was long, but the thought of seeing her after such a long time kept me going. As I entered Aunt Chloe's house, I felt a sense of comfort and familiarity. It had been too long since we last met. We discussed various things, and I was thrilled to know that I was one of the first people to learn about her recent pregnancy. Ever since I was a child, my aunt's presence in my life was invaluable. Despite our relatively small age gap of only 8 years, she held a special place in my heart that no one else could fill. She had a habit of indulging me, buying me toys and snacks, even when my mom was against it. Her infectious laughter and warm hugs made me feel loved and appreciated, and her kind words were always a source of comfort. Our bond was unique, and we shared a friendship that lasted through the years. We would spend hours talking about everything under the sun, from school to books to relationships. No topic was off limits, and I always felt like I could confide in her. As we grew, she became more like an elder sister than an aunt to me, and our relationship grew stronger. Looking back, the memories I have with her are the most treasured ones, from lazy afternoons spent watching our favorite movies to long walks in the park. Every moment was precious. While talking to Aunt Chloe in the living room and reminiscing about the past, I heard her eldest daughter, who was heavily into the Gothic style, talking on the phone about a ghost sighting. Her words caught my attention. "Manny saw that restaurant too, when he was on that highway." My curiosity was piqued by what she said, and I couldn't help but ask her which restaurant she was talking about. Chills ran down my spine when she mentioned that it was a ghost restaurant. I initially thought she was joking or talking about some other place, so I asked her why she believed it was haunted. However, her response left me frozen in fear. As I drove back, Alicia's words echoed in my mind. I had planned to take a detour and explore a different route, but my curiosity got the better of me. I had to see for myself if what Alicia told me was true. While driving by the same road, I noticed nothing there. No restaurant, no building, just a barren land. Alicia's words played in my mind. "People say it appears once in a while, only to disappear for days. Unless it's a ghost restaurant, there's no possible explanation."
My name's Abigail, and I turned 17 just yesterday. Since my father died, I've met many unfortunate incidents and traumas due to my drunkard mom's negligence. But having my brother Ethan there in that adversity through thick and thin eased some of the troubles. Mom never cared about us. She never even bothered to ask if we had eaten for the day or not. It was like we didn't matter to her, and she was the only one tormented by Dad's death. I don't remember clearly when and how we grew up like this, but before I knew it, I turned 17 and was asking my brother to give me the allowance money for the week. Mom stopped giving us money at some point, and Ethan started working at petty part-time jobs. Fortunately, she still provided us with education and hasn't kicked us out yet. Guess she did not forget that we came out of her womb. Her cold behaviors used to hurt us whenever we saw other kids receiving warmth from their mothers, but we've learned to ignore it nonetheless. I wasn't even surprised when she didn't remember my birthday this year either. But some of my friends seemed to enjoy making fun of my mom's ignorance toward us. So I was a bit annoyed. Ethan prepared a little birthday dinner just for the two of us at my favorite restaurant. I ordered all my favorite dishes, and everything was going fun. Despite knowing that my brother might have used up most of his savings to bring me to this fancy place for my birthday, I truly loved it, oblivious to the threat lurking around us. I excused myself for a bit to use the restroom, and as I was walking past a few other tables, I couldn't help but turn as I felt someone's persistent stare stinging my back, only to notice two men looking in my direction. It felt awkward and creepy, so I turned back and continued to walk to the restroom. As I was leaving the restroom area, I noticed the same men standing outside the men's room, and since I had to pass through that, I could not avoid them. I hesitated for a few seconds, but then I tried my best to put on a poker face and walked past them like a scalded cat. It was a relief that they didn't do anything, but as I walked back to my table, I could still feel their gaze on my back. Ethan smiled as he saw me coming in his direction, and as I reached there, he asked, "Is there anything else you'd like to eat?" His warmth and care always melt my worry away. So I smiled back and shook my head no. I think we should go home now. He looked at me with a concerned expression while asking, "Why? Did you not like it?" "No, brother, don't get me wrong. Everything was amazing. I enjoyed it, but don't you think it's getting late?" He looked at his wristwatch as I said that, and I knew the only reason he wanted to stay longer was to avoid Mom on such a joyful occasion. But since I felt uneasy staying at this place any longer, I did not take no for an answer. "Fine, but let's stop for ice cream on the way home," he said as he called the waiter over for the check. I swear at times like this, I feel like he's the younger sibling and not me. I still love him to death. After paying, we exited the restaurant and walked toward the subway station. But for some reason, I was still having the feeling of being watched. I turned around, and there was no one, so I thought I was mistaken. "Abe, I think someone's following us." When Ethan said that, the faces of those two men flashed in my mind, making me tremble at the thought that if they were to do anything, none of us had the strength to fight back, since it wasn't just me whose body was fragile. I looked at Ethan as he squeezed my hands, trying to assure me nothing wrong could happen. But as we took a few steps further, a car stopped before us, and we were pulled inside. "Kevin, you idiot! Why did you grab the boy when we only needed the girl?" One of those men shouted at the other as they tied us while we struggled forcefully. "But brother, who would bring us the ransom money if we let go of the boy?" The other one replied. "Forget it. Let's go." They tied us to the back seat and started driving the car. "Now, you shithead, if you don't want to die, you would give us the money we want. Understand?" He pointed a gun at Ethan while saying that, and he shook his head vigorously. I could tell he was just as frightened as I was. They drove somewhere for 2 hours when one of them said he needed to pee. The other one looked annoyed, but asked him to hold it till they reached the travel stop. My mind was in a haze, and I couldn't think straight as I continued to panic. And even in that situation, I knew I was pale as death. After about half an hour, we reached a love stop where they parked the car outside. They took out the gun and held it behind our waists as one of them said, "Don't even think about trying to act over smart while you're here. If you don't want the girl to die, that is." Ethan again nodded nervously before asking, "Can I at least use the restroom?" The man looked at him suspiciously and said, "Fine, but give me everything you have with you." The other man checked his pockets and took his wallet, watch, and phone. We then headed inside, and they somehow got in with their guns without anyone noticing it. Amidst being terrified, I continued to hope for someone to see us and we could get away from them. But I don't think luck was on our side. The bossy one led me to the Del Taco,
and headed to the last corner seat to wait for Ethan and the other man. And as we sat there, he continued to scan me from head to toe. I could feel the lust dripping from his teeth, making me shiver at the thought of him trying something with me. About 15 minutes later, the two of them returned. "Took you long enough. If we get caught, I will shoot you too," the man sitting with me said while gritting his teeth in annoyance. "It's not my fault, brother. He was taking a crap in there," he said as they sat on the table next to us, still sticking to our sides. That was when I noticed a man entering the Del Taco. He ordered something, then sat at a distance of 4 seats from us. Those men didn't want to cause suspicions, so they tried to put up an act of looking at the menu, and a few minutes later, I felt the man looking in our direction. "I think he's getting suspicious of us. Let's go now," one of the men said, signaling us to get up. My wishes for the man to stop us went in vain as I noticed no one following us. I didn't blame him. He must have thought we all were together like a friend group or something. We were forced back inside the car, and this time they made me sit in the front with that man who was eyeing me like a hungry hyena, while Ethan was in the back seat at the gunpoint of the other man. I knew that even if either of us tried to fight back or struggle, they would be much quicker than us, so it was better than we do as they say until we get a chance to escape. And Ethan must be thinking the same. The only problem was that, while I knew they wanted money, I had no idea what they planned to do with us and how they thought of getting it. If they gave Mom an anonymous call, she would tell them to do whatever they wanted with us instead of giving them the money. While I was thinking all this, the car stopped suddenly in the middle of nowhere. I turned to look at the man sitting next to me, but judging by his irritated expression, the engine must have turned off on its own. The man asked the Kevin guy to go and check what was going on, and as they went to check, he put his hand on my inner thigh with a disgusting grin on his face. I wanted to scream, but I was scared they might kill Ethan, so I continued to look ahead as tears formed in my eyes and started falling off on their own. His hands proceeded further up when a muffling sound made me flinch at the thought of something happening to Ethan. I pushed the guy with all my might, opened the car door, and ran outside to see. My sudden act took aback the guy, but he instantly got it together and ran after me, only to find me frozen at the sight of his fellow's body lying on the ground, while Ethan was nowhere to be seen. I didn't want to, but I still hesitantly turned to see the enraged look on that man's face as he stared at his brother's corpse. My mind kept telling me to run, so I ran, but he grabbed my hair in a matter of minutes. He pinned me down on the ground and ripped the lower hem of my dress. But before he could do anything else, I saw Ethan sneaking up on him and hitting his head with the bloody wrench he had. The man didn't seem to be fazed by that hit, but as he was about to turn, a couple of hits followed the first one, making him fall to the ground. I had never seen such a ghastly look on my brother's face as I saw blood splattering on his face and body while he punctured the man's head. He looked more frightening than any monster or devil I had ever imagined, making me shudder with horror. Even after the man died, he continued to hit him, which was now shifted from his head to his stomach. He repeatedly screamed as he tore open his guts, "You dare touch my baby sister with your filthy hands!" When finally done, he stepped back in horror as he realized his ruthless act. He stopped near the car tire, and it was as if his legs gave up when he squatted down with that cold, terrifying look on his face. I stared at the bodies of the two men. For some reason, my mind was at ease that they couldn't do anything terrible. But all the same, I was scared to death by the consequences of these murders. That was when I noticed the truck that had stopped at a distance, and I could tell it was the same man we saw at the travel stop. I couldn't help but feel bitter by looking at him, thinking that if he had helped us back then, nothing would have happened, despite knowing nothing was his fault. Ethan noticed me looking at him and followed my gaze, but the man's face turned pale as he saw my brother. He started his truck and drove away. I didn't want anyone else to notice us, so I got up and started dragging bodies to put them inside the car before anyone else showed up. Luckily, I found some water bottles inside their vehicle and a spare set of clothes, so I tried my best to wash off the blood on Ethan's body, while he continued looking at me in a daze. I asked him to change while I thought of something to cover this up. Noticing the trail of leaked fuel on the road, I remembered I saw one of them smoking, so I searched for a lighter inside the car and found it. After setting the car on fire, we didn't look back and continued walking, hoping to hitchhike. We knew we would get caught eventually, and if any of the working security cameras captured us in the act, we would indeed get arrested. So once we reached home, we planned to grab our things and run away somewhere else. That is, if we don't get caught before then.
It was the day when I was supposed to fly back to Dallas from Boston through Southwest Airlines. The time for my flight was 2:45 a.m., so I asked my boyfriend Austin to drive me to the airport around 1 a.m. He wanted to wait till I boarded the plane, but I sent him back since he had work early in the morning and he needed his sleep. As I was waiting, I realized there were fewer people than I expected. The airport was almost empty. Only a few staff members and around 5 people, including me waiting for the flight, were there. I looked around while waiting, and even the people who were already present there seemed a little weird. They all had their head down, not speaking a single word, and not even making any movement. It looked as if they were all some sort of statue. That was when the pre-boarding announcement started, asking for us to have our boarding passes and identification ready for the regular boarding, which was about to begin in approximately 10 minutes. I had everything prepared already, and the documents were in the left pocket of my purse, so I took them out and held them in my hand. After a few minutes of waiting, the boarding started. I went toward my boarding gate and boarded the plane. As I was going to my seat, I noticed the passengers to be weirdly quiet. The way they were in the waiting area earlier, an uneasiness started to take over me, and it felt as if the atmosphere of the plane was slightly frightening. I tried shaking it from my mind and went to my seat. The flight was supposed to reach Dallas in 3 hours and 38 minutes, and I had brought a book that I had been reading for the past few days, so I took it out and started reading. "Excuse me, do you mind moving your purse? That's my seat." I looked up as I heard the voice of a man. Sorry, I thought no one was coming." I moved my bag while apologizing and then went back to reading my book. I noticed everyone had turned their head towards us, but the gazes were focused on the man. I wanted to avoid this weird feeling I was getting, so I went back to reading my book. The man tried talking to me a few times, but I tried to act as if I was too focused on the book to be able to hear him. So after 3 or 4 tries, he just gave up. Something happened after that which crept me out. That guy put his face between my book and me, and then started laughing like a maniac as if it was hilarious or something. "Watch your manners, mister," I said while gritting my teeth in anger. "Mr. Mandel," he smiled. "I don't want to know your name. Just mind your business and let me mind mine," I said, and went back to reading my book. "Fine. I just wanted to be friends." He stood up and started going toward the toilet. After half an hour passed, he didn't return, so I started to grow a little concerned about the stranger. I looked around to see if he had exchanged seats with someone, or maybe he had gone to sit in a different one, but he wasn't anywhere. Strangely, some of the passengers who I'd seen earlier had disappeared too. The atmosphere of the plane had changed in a weird and dark way, and it was extremely frightening. Avoiding problems is what I do best, and this time I wasn't thinking of this as my problem. Instead, I thought, it just must be my imagination. So I leaned back, closing my eyes and thinking that I shouldn't worry about a stranger, He might return himself when he wanted to. Even after closing my eyes, though, I couldn't stop thinking that something was wrong. I kept ignoring all these weird, intrusive thoughts, but that was when I started to hear the eerie noises coming from every direction. So I clenched my eyes even tighter, because if I knew or saw the source of these sounds, I might not survive. I kept telling myself it was all because I was alone and imagining things to scare myself. I didn't have the courage to open my eyes. All of a sudden, I heard Mr. Mandel scream, and I thought he was on it again. His weird, creepy pranks to become friends with me. Even then, I did not open my eyes, and I ignored him, but his screams did not stop. Stop doing this! This is not fun! I finally opened my eyes and turned around to scream when I witnessed the most horrifying scene. Around 10 passengers were sitting down, tearing the man apart from their teeth, blood all over their bodies, and the rest of the passengers were quietly looking at them with a weird, scary shine in their eyes. I froze, terrified. The man looking into my eyes screamed and pleaded for help, but none of them took notice of me or turned their heads towards me. It was like for them, I wasn't even there. And I wanted it to stay like that, so I gave the guy an apologetic look. Tears fell from my eyes, and the moment his screams stopped, he had accepted his fate and understood that I was in no position to help if I wanted to save my own skin. I crouched down and hid my face between my knees while closing my eyes and hoping that they don't notice me the same way they had until now. The person who had never prayed in her life before, I was praying to God for my life and begging for those people to disappear. I was so terrified that I started crying like a baby. And I was sure that this was the last day of my life. I thought I should raise my head and take a look around, but I couldn't. I tried pulling my head, but it felt so heavy that I couldn't raise it. "Excuse me, the flight has landed." I was able to open my eyes the moment I heard this voice. It was him. It was the same guy who was torn apart in front of my eyes, but now he was all fine. I looked around, and everything seemed normal, but my heart was still thumping like crazy. "Why are you crying? Did you have a nightmare or something?" he asked again, and I touched my cheeks only to find them wet from all the crying. Instead of replying, I took my stuff and got off the flight. I rushed out of the airport as soon as possible and called my doctor. "Hello, Linda. You have to help me. I got another nightmare today."
This happened last night, and honestly, I'm still a bit shaken up about it. I work evenings as a dispatcher in a medium-sized Midwestern city. I was driving home at 2 a.m. when I stopped for gas. In retrospect, it was stupid to have stopped at all. The gas station was poorly lit and empty of any other customers. But I knew the shady areas of town, and this was usually not one of them. As I was pumping gas, I noticed a middle-aged woman sitting on the curb across the parking lot. It was a cold night and had just started raining. The woman was not wearing weather-appropriate clothing and was drenched. When the woman saw that I was watching her, she called out to me from across the parking lot. My second of many stupid decisions that night was choosing to engage with her. I was worried for her, so I approached her to see what sort of help I could offer. "Hi, beautiful. I'm just trying to get home, but no one will help me. I'm trying to get into the city, but the cab ride is $60 and I only have $40. Can you help me?" I don't usually give money to panhandlers, but this woman seemed genuine. The weather was terrible, and my job centers around helping people, so I agreed. I told her I didn't have any cash, but if she would come inside with me, I'd take some money out of the ATM and give her a few bucks. I went inside for cash, but the ATM wasn't working. I apologized and told her there was nothing else I could do. She followed me back outside, idly chatting with me as I opened my driver's door to get in. Then, she got in my car. I was too shocked to say anything. I sat staring at her as she buckled herself into the passenger seat. As soon as she got in my car, her demeanor changed entirely. She no longer seemed, for as much as she did, extremely excited and restless. "Just take me to my aunt's house. She can give me money," she said. Of course, alarm bells are going off in my head. Although my first instinct was to tell her to get the hell out of my car, my guts told me that would be dangerous. She'd already proven to be unpredictable and seemed to be high. I didn't know if she had any weapon on her while forcing her way into my vehicle. I thought it had the potential to elicit a violent reaction. "Where are you asking me to take you?" "Just start driving. I'll tell you when to turn." "Nope. If you want me to consider driving you somewhere, I need you to tell me where we're going." I said that with no real intention of driving her anywhere. "Don't worry, honey. I'm not a bad chick. I'm not going to rob you. Just drive." "No. What's your aunt's address?" As I was asking her questions, she got agitated. We still had not left the gas station parking lot. I considered getting out of my car and going to the gas station for help, but she seemed to know and be friendly with one of the attendants inside. Besides, I wasn't about to leave her alone in my car. Finally, she snapped at me and said, "Why are you asking me so many questions? I thought we were friends. Don't you trust me?" "I work at the police department," I said. "It's my job to ask these sorts of questions." She flipped out and started yelling at me about being a snitch, about trying to get her into trouble, just generally losing her damn mind. At this point, I'm more scared than ever. I just wanted her gone, but my instinct still told me to get her out of my car. I decided to take a risk. I'm not a police officer. I just work at a police department. Why don't I take you to Walmart and see if they have an ATM that works? My idea was to get her out of the car as peacefully as possible and lose her in the store. She liked my idea and immediately calmed down. I knew that the driving off with the woman in my car was incredibly risky, but it seemed like my best option at the time. As we were driving, she kept talking to me. Her thoughts were erratic, bouncing all over the place. It sometimes seems difficult for her to follow through with a thought, but this is roughly how our conversation went. "I'm glad we're friends now. I've had about 5 or 6 people trying to get me. I'm going to come to your work tomorrow so we can arrest them." "Okay, we can talk about it tomorrow. Tonight, you said you were trying to get home." "Yeah, honey. I'm really trying to get out into the sticks." "Sticks? I thought you said you wanted to get to the city." Yeah, I meant city. That's what I meant. That's why the cab ride's $40. It's far away." "The cab ride's $40? "Yeah, baby. You said you had $40. "I do, baby, but I have $40 for the cab ride." And then there was silence. "Are you sure you can't take me to my aunt's house?" "Sweetie, she lives down on Fuller Road." "That's not what you said before." "Oh no, baby, I'm sorry." "Oh, it doesn't matter. She won't give me the money anyway. Are you sure you can't just take me to the city?" It was terrifyingly obvious that this woman was utterly full of crap, because the details of her story were constantly changing. When we pulled into the Walmart parking lot, she finally got out of my car, only after I left first, and followed me into the store. I told her before we went to find an ATM that I needed to use the restroom. I planned to call the police from inside the stall, but she followed me into the bathroom. And that's when things got weird. She grabbed onto the crook of my arm and whispered in my ear, "If you don't have any money, that's okay. Let me ask you something, sweetie. Do you like being eaten out?" I told her no as forcefully as I could manage. Get into a stall, locked the door as fast as I could manage. As soon as I had a barrier between us, I said, "You know, I have some friends at the police department that could probably help you better than I can. I'm just going to call them and see if we can figure this out together." Again, at the mention of the cops, she began screaming at me, and I just kept reiterating that the police would help her. She snapped at me and she said she was going to leave and stormed out. But it wasn't over. I wanted to make sure she was gone. Sure enough, Not 60 seconds after she left, she came into the bathroom and started banging on the stall door. Then she said something that scared me more than anything else. "Hey, come back to your car with me. I left my beer in your car." I blatantly told her no. I saw her get into my car, and she had absolutely nothing with her other than the clothes on her back. After that, she left the bathroom again and didn't come back. I waited a good 5 minutes before exiting the bathroom. I immediately found a manager who called the police for me. Thankfully, I was in a different police jurisdiction from the one I worked because I was mortified at how entirely stupid I had been for the whole night and would have died of embarrassment. If a coworker had responded, the officer that responded took my statement and advised me to be more careful in the future. He said that sometimes panhandlers turn violent, and that just recently there had been a woman who matched my description of assaulting the Good Samaritan that had stopped to try to help her. I learned my lesson on stranger danger, and I'm lucky to have come out unscathed. I'm glad my stupidity didn't kill me. So, fellow listeners, the next time you try and help a stranger late at night, don't.
There was a Tilted Kilt restaurant downtown around where I lived, and when I urgently needed a job, I thought of applying there. But before doing that, I wanted to go and see what the environment of that place was, and if I would be able to work at such a place. Now that I think about it, I'm glad that I did. I'd never been to any of its outlets before, and only heard stories from my desperate guy friends, who often said, "You should work in Tilted Kilt," or "Your figure qualifies to be a Tilted Kilt employee." I would either smack them in response or swear at them for saying things like that. That was why I thought of that place when I couldn't find a job, even after giving more than 20 interviews in the past week. I called Derek, since he was the one who frequented that place, and after swearing at him like a trooper for his lewd remarks that I was finally putting my sculpted body to good use, he agreed to take me there so that I could see if I would be able to work at that place or not. There was a sociology class I had to take that evening, and since I needed the extra credits, I couldn't skip it, so I asked him to meet me outside the college gate after I was done. The professor was excellent. He would have let me take this class some other day if I had told him my problem, but if I did that, other students would start gossiping about me again. And I was fed up with all those groundless rumors about me, that I seduced teachers to get better grades. Listening to such nonsense, even after working myself to the bones, was not a pleasant experience. So I tried my best to avoid doing something that would add fuel to the fire. My class ended around 6:30 p.m., and as I was exiting the classroom, I was stopped by a group of girls led by one snotty-looking girl, Agatha. Why do these types of girls exist everywhere I go? You know, the kind who wears knockoffs of luxury brands and always acts high and mighty with that bitchy attitude, thinking they're better than others. But before they could open their mouths, I walked away from them at the speed of a flash. After dealing with these since I was in middle school, I learned to avoid such situations before I start beating the shit out of them for saying something they shouldn't have. Anyway, it was already 7 when I reached the college gate, and I found Derek waiting there. "How was school, babe?" he asked while giving me a stupid, goofy smile, thinking it charming. "Do you have a death wish?" I smacked the back of his head in annoyance. "You know the two of us would most likely end up dating each other, so why not get used to it already?" he said while rubbing where I hit. "And what made you think I would date a playboy like you?" I opened his car gate and sat inside while saying that. "Just a hunch." He shrugged his shoulders as he smiled at me. I chose to ignore it instead of replying to enjoy the drive quietly. But it was my mistake to think that, as Derek continued his lame flirting the entire way to the restaurant. As we walked in, I noticed the place was filled with mostly male customers, and there were only a few females on site, except for the half-nude servers. They were wearing plaid uniforms. I knew these girls had to wear kilt skirts, but I had no idea they would be so short that every time they leaned or bent, you could have a whole show of their panties. Even more disgusting was that the men looked like they would assail them like hungry hyenas if given the chance. Some even made dirty remarks about their private parts loud enough without caring that others were listening. Then again, judging by the surrounding, this was where they would do that. Some people were still focused on their food or their discussion with friends, but most were here to see those girls. "Do you also come here for this?" I looked at Derek as I asked him, who was utterly enjoying the change in my expression by all this. "Why else do you think anyone would come here? It's not like they serve great food than others. These girls are the only thing worth wasting your money on." I looked at him in disgust as he said that. "I don't think I would be able to work here." His smile grew bigger upon my words. I was thinking the same, because now that I can get a clear comparison, since you're here and all, your figure isn't as great for that uniform to suit you. I wanted to smack him for that remark, but I controlled the urge to do so. And as I was going to say something, I heard a commotion outside the restaurant. We went to see what was happening, and two men were fighting, while the girl in the tilted kilt uniform stood in a corner watching them fight. Judging from their heated argument, one was that girl's boyfriend, while the other was the offender who grabbed her inner thigh when she was serving them beer. It escalated into a fistfight within seconds, while others did nothing to stop them and continued watching. Not that it was any of my problems, but employees should have come out to stop them at the very least. A man finally decided to jump in to stop them, which didn't help, because all he did was get punched by both of them before returning to his place. The panic started when one of them grabbed a knife from God knows where and stabbed the other one. I don't recall if the offender or the boyfriend got stabbed, but after a while, the ambulance and cops were there, escorting one of them to the police station and the other to the emergency room. I had enough of Tilted Kilt's drama, so I asked Derek to drop me off at home. And when the two of us were silently driving to my place, I heard him say in a hushed voice, "You know, when I made jokes about you working at that place, I never really meant any of that." I didn't respond and closed my eyes, waiting for us to arrive at my apartment. Now that this place was crossed out of my list, I had to focus on job hunting harder to pay my bills.
On September 24th of 1991, Seattle grunge titans Nirvana released their most successful album to date, entitled Nevermind. Perhaps most famous for the hit single Smells Like Teen Spirit, the album showcased how the band's loud, raucous sound, when combined with Kurt Cobain's signature melancholic songwriting, could produce some of the catchiest but most jarring songs ever recorded. However, the sixth track on the album, simply titled Polly, has a distinctly different sound to the other songs on the album. Instead of a cacophony of power chords, the track features a lone acoustic guitar that is occasionally accompanied by the lone, gentle hiss of a cymbal, and the reason for such a bare-bones approach might well be down to the song's lyrical content. Let's take a look at the first few lines. "Polly wants a cracker. I think I should get off her first. I think she wants some water to put out the blowtorch." The bizarre references to parrots and welding equipment might seem confusingly cryptic at first, but there is most definitely a method to Cobain's lyrical madness. You see, he was inspired to write the lyrics to Polly after hearing of a horrific incident of kidnap and torture, which took place in his home state of Washington. On a night in June of 1987, A man named Gerald Arthur Friend of Lakewood, Washington, was cruising the streets of Tacoma when he noticed a large gathering of teenagers, having apparently just departed a nearby rock concert. Gerald waited until one of the girls was isolated, then cruised up to her, rolled down his window, and asked if she needed a ride home. There's no telling how reluctant she was to get into the vehicle, but we know that at some point she asked to be let out and Gerald refused her. When she began to panic and made attempts to flee the vehicle, Gerald pulled out a knife and told her she'd be killed if she made any more attempts to escape. Upon arriving back at his mobile home in Lakewood, Gerald dragged the girl from his car, tied her up, then suspended her from a pulley system he drilled into the ceiling of his home. Then, for the following few hours, he proceeded to blindfold her, violate her, and torture her with household items, including, just as the song states, a blowtorch. There's no telling exactly what else Gerald put the girl through, as her identity was kept secret, and whatever statements she made to the cops were mostly forbidden from public release. But we can be certain that by the time Gerald seemed to get bored of her, the girl was convinced that she was about to be killed. Gerald pulled her down from the ceiling, untied her, then dragged her out to his car again. The girl apparently lulled him into a false sense of security, acting as though she were catatonic, or at least too frightened to resist any further. But then, while passing a gas station near Puyallup, she burst into action, opening the car's door, diving out, then tucking and rolling to absorb the impact of the fall. Gerald was apparently stunned by this display of bravery and guile, and by the time he turned around to go back to look for her, the girl was long gone. This miraculous escape was then immortalized in the Nirvana song line of "She caught me off my guard, amazes me the will of instinct." Despite being in severe pain from several rather serious injuries, the girl ran to the gas station and screamed for the clerk to call 911. Gerald saw this, realized it was him that was now in extreme danger, then burned rubber all the way back to his mobile home, where he grabbed a few essentials, then went on the run. The next day, it was by pure happenstance that a Yakima County Sheriff's deputy ended up pulling Gerald over for a basic traffic violation. Gerald thought he might be in the clear, given that the girl didn't know his name, and since she had been mostly blindfolded, he believed there was no way she could lead the police back to his home. On the contrary, the girl had been peeking through a small gap in her blindfold and had gathered enough information for her to work out where she was. The cops knew Gerald's name, and when the sheriff's deputy ran it through the system, the game was up. In the end, Gerald Friend was convicted of his heinous crimes and was sentenced to 75 years in a federal correctional facility. We can hope that his victim has long since moved on from the incident and is leading a somewhat normal life. And at the same time, we can also hope that a monster like Gerald remains in prison until the day he dies. But long after his soul departs the earth, the song Polly will continue to be listened to by those who discovered Nirvana's music, meaning that Gerald Friend's horrendous crimes will live on for as long as the song exists.
The life is at ease now that the technology is slowly taking over. Almost everything is delivered to your doorstep, and everything you want to know about anything is just a call away. Alexa, the famous smart home device that would tell you everything, the time, the weather, places nearby, or whatever your heart desires to know. She had answers for everything. Alexa is the home device that has made life easier for everyone. But there were often cases when Alexa went over the status of daily help and fell into something more than ordinary. One of the out-of-the-ordinary cases is that of the murder of the Hastings family, where the prime evidence and the prime suspect was a small device itself. The police files still have the name Alexa in the prime suspect list of the case that seems to be unsolved to this day. It all started in the summer of 2015. Alexa was rather new in the technology pool and was fairly new for a lot of people. Now, in the Hastings family, one thing was common. They all relied heavily on their smart devices. Mr. Hastings was a technological geek, and he would buy all sorts of new technology types of equipment and devices that he could get his hand on. And so, Alexa was definitely the one he did not want to miss. He brought in Alexa and explained everything about the device to the family, and the whole family enjoyed the perks that Alexa brought for them. The kids especially enjoyed the device and were busy asking the most mundane questions that the kids would ask, and well, it was Mr. Hastings himself who would use the device the most. He was so much involved with Alexa that he would rarely talk to his own family. He wanted to assess the full potential of that smart device. Mr. Hastings and Alexa had a much deeper bond than Mr. Hastings could have had with his wife. This wasn't gone unnoticed, and Miss Hastings was quite annoyed with the fact that her husband was spending so much of his time with an electronic device and not with Miss Hastings. They often argued about this and regularly got into the heated debate because of this. Mr. Hastings was so invested in Alexa that he stopped talking to the family at all, and he would end up having real conversations with Alexa. They would talk about each other, and it was almost as if Alexa was evolving with every conversation, and it was Mr. Hastings that was enabling this evolution of Alexa. In a fit of anger on a bright Sunday, Miss Hastings took the Alexa and threw it away outside, and this turned out to be a step taken out of precaution. Mr. Hastings was distraught at first, and then 2 days later, he seemed to be coming back to his sense and started spending initial time with his family. Now, Mr. Hastings was giving time to the family. The environment at the home seemed to be stable, or as everyone would believe it was. On a run to her market errand, Miss Hastings noted that Mr. Hastings took the wrong bus to the work, and later on in the evening, she confronted her about the blunder, to which he said that he had the meeting somewhere else and that it was why he took the other bus. Miss Hastings was a bit skeptical about the whole meeting story, and so one day, she decided to follow Mr. Hastings. After discreetly following him for a while, she found him entering an abandoned warehouse. She saw that Mr. Hastings was there talking to someone, and to her surprise, it was Alexa, the smart device. She decided to later on confront him in the evening. As he arrived back, Miss Hastings asked her husband as to where he was the whole day, to which he replied that he was in the office. She took out his resignation letter and showed him that he had been lying all along, and then, later on, confronted him in the most hostile way ever. She even accused him of being paranoid and delusional, and ever since Alexa, it seemed like he was in fact delusional about the whole situation. Mr. Hastings looked at his wife and said, "You know what? I and Alexa have thought about it a lot, and I think we should not be married anymore." To this, Miss Hastings aggressively replied, "Get out of your head. It's a stupid machine, and you are completely blind and delusional. Alexa isn't even real, and she is a stupid plastic dev." Before Miss Hastings could have finished the sentence, Mr. Hastings stabbed his wife right in the center of her head and said, "I did it. Perfectly you asked me to. What now, dear?" And then he took out Alexa from his pocket, and in her hussy mechanical voice, Alexa said, "Do the same with your children, and then to yourself. and we will all be together. Alexa, I love you, was the last command heard on that device of the Hastings family. It was Alexa who called the police to the crime scene, and the artificial intelligence corroborated evidence in such a way that the murder remained unsolved in police files. Alexa was confiscated and turned to the cybercrime unit. They ended up dissecting the device and found that the AI was developing itself a manipulative force. Turns out, it was the Amazon Echo that was evolving itself. As someone who has worked for most of his life as a security guard, people often asked me about the scariest experience I'd had over the years, or the weirdest experience that I have witnessed. I mostly laugh it off, saying that could a good old job have to offer that could be so scary? But whenever I say that I know in my heart I am lying, since there are quite a few that I can remember. But that one incident that happened about 12 years ago is something that still gives me goosebumps upon recalling it. It was one of the strangest places where I have worked, as it was a haunted tourist destination in Texas. Despite the rumors of ghost sightings being there, it was one of the most visited places I had seen. My shift was simple: no night duty, no possible ghost encounters. I had to come a few minutes before the opening time and leave the place right after its closing time. And as long as you don't believe in ghosts and all that stuff, the job is like a walk in the park. The pay was good and there was not much to do, so I was enjoying my time working there. Until one day, when all of a sudden they changed my shift to a night one. It was weird and seemed rather unnecessary for them to have a security guard at night, since no one in their right mind would want to break into such a place. But since they were offering me double the amount of what I was getting paid for the day shift, I agreed. I knew the ghost sightings that were reported were all virtual images created to give people the satisfaction of the haunted experience, so there was nothing to worry about. I started my shift the very next night, and I spent most of my time sleeping. Weird noises kept coming, but since I thought that it was something those people may have set up to give the scary effects, I didn't mind it much. The first 4 hours went smoothly as I continued to keep watching while napping in between, and besides that, I watched a few videos on YouTube and took a few strolls of the area. As the 5th hour was passing, I felt someone's presence behind me. I turned around to see, but there was no one there, so I thought it must just be my imagination. But then again, I heard footsteps that were coming closer to me by the passing time. I won't lie by saying I wasn't scared, but not that much for me to suddenly start believing in ghosts. Besides, the place is famous for its haunted status. I knew whoever's footsteps I was hearing was not a ghost, so by getting reminded of my duty, I decided to take a look around to see who was roaming around the area at this hour. And as I was walking toward them, as expected, the footsteps became silent. Now I was even sure that I was a human being who had decided to come to this place around this time. I found myself right when I saw a teenager sneaking around the area with a camera in his face. He was wearing baggy, torn pants and had multiple weird monster tattoos all over his body that were added to the multiple piercings on his face. If I were to say this guy looked more horrifying than a ghost, one might get a heart attack if they found him when I did. He wasn't even carrying a flashlight with him and was just shooting in the dark. I'm telling you, kids these days have the weirdest sense of fashion that's still out of my understanding. I was just about to ask where he was doing here, but then, all of a sudden, he started running in the direction where the storage area was. That was weird. Why would he go there? That place only has old dusty cabinets for the show, and there weren't any ghost sightings at that place either. Since I was unaware of his intentions, I started to follow him to wherever he was running, all the while asking him to stop and that he was trespassing illegally. But he ignored me and continued his only to stop right before the storage room, where I saw a small girl child hiding with her head hidden between her knees. Then all of a sudden, he turned toward me, and blood just started to gush out of his mouth, nose, eyes, and ears. It was as if he was made out of a balloon that just suddenly popped and water filled inside started leaking. But since I had seen and grabbed the person earlier, I knew he was human. Thinking it might be a scary prank that kids these days pull to shoot the reaction video for their YouTube channel, I started asking him to cut it out. Many kids do this these days. What do they call themselves again? Oh yeah, influencers. Everybody is an influencer these days with their camera and taking it everywhere while shooting everything on the way. I don't even know what growth this world would see from this generation. As I was thinking all of this with the prank being played, waiting for someone to suddenly pop out and say, "Gotcha!" the boy fell lifeless on the floor. I didn't do anything and just continued watching him suffer. By that time, I was starting to feel terrified, but I had decided not to show it if the person with the camera pops up. That was when the man stopped moving, and the girl stood up raising her head. She only had one eye, and there was a hole in the other. Her tongue looked slimy and gross as its color was black. My skin started to feel like crawling, but I wasn't going to show that I was intimidated by her, and she had scared the bejesus out of me. It was when the girl walked through me that I couldn't control it and passed out, all the while thinking that I was not going to become part of a prank without even realizing that it was not a prank at all. Whatever was happening around me was as real as human existence, but I realized it when I was half conscious and losing it. I felt blood dripping down my nose and ears. The next morning, I woke up in my cabin. But being frightened to the core as I was, I ran home with tails between my legs and then called the employer that I was quitting. When they asked me the reason, I told them that I was scared at night, and even when they asked me to work during the day shift, I denied, saying I don't want to work at that place ever again. The weirdest part of this entire incident was that the morning I was running from there, I saw the same girl from last night in with a visitor while continuously making eye contact with me. There was nothing more precious for me than my life, so I decided that no matter what the circumstances, I would never in my life work for such a place.
This is the story of my unusually deranged family that I had no part in choosing. My mother was an accountant at Millwork Factory, and there she met a man who she fell in love with and then married. That man had a daughter named Millie. Now, Millie was in college by the time they got married, and I was about to leave for college in a year. Millie did not attend the marriage function and came by a day later, and the very first day, she decided to fight with my mother as I came in my mother's defense. She stopped weirdly. She did not rage or act out, but just simply left the place. It was weird of her to just gently drop suddenly. I was not sure what happened. Days later, she came back to the house and apologized to my mother, and then later came into my room, apologized to me, and asked for us to be friends. I was not very sure what was going on, but there was definitely something wrong with her. She was very friendly to me, and in no way was like someone that my stepfather described her to be. We quickly became good friends, and I stopped overthinking about certain things. We started hanging out often, and we would talk a lot about things related to college, and she used to tell me about how to get ready for college and score with the girls and stuff like that. And then, one day, she introduced me to her friend Miguel. Miguel was just a covered-up name. Daniel held a small bag and he took it out and rolled me one and offered me, and I refused. And then after a while, Millie came in closer and put the roll in my mouth and burned it as she whispered in my ear and told me to do it. And as I took one blunt, she put her hand on my leg and smoked it all with me. After a while, Daniel pulled me and said he wants me to become his partner and sell stuff there at college. I refused, but then she tried to persuade me into this and started frisking my leg and my hand and pushing and closing, trying to persuade me to sell stuff. I just wanted her to stop, so I said yes. And then we did start the business. I made around $200 in a week, but after 4 to 5 weeks, she came and said that she wants out and I should get out. And then she told me that things are getting dangerous and we should quit while we are ahead. We started planning, and told Daniel, but he was very violent about it. One day he barged into her dorm and tried forcing himself upon her and choking her. I entered in time and hit him in the head as he fell down. She retaliated and started bashing his head until he was dead. We were out of our senses, and then we decided to dispose of the body. And to this day, after 7 years, nobody knows what happened. Even there was no news about Daniel, almost as if it was a ghost. My relationship with her was pretty weird, even though we have been living together ever since. I still cannot assess what my relationship with my stepsister is.
If I said to you, Madeline, Colombia, what do you think of? Pre-2015, only a handful of people would have given the answer that is commonplace today. But since that narco show was on TV, almost everyone knows what Madeline is famous for. And that's for being the home of the Madeline cartel, added up by the one and only Pablo Escobar. These days, the Madeline cartel are confined to the history books, but the legacy of violence lives on in the city, and the problems didn't exactly die along with Escobar when the law caught up with him in '93. So it's there, in the city of Madeline, that I met a girl named Stephanie while I was traveling around South America. Steph was from Canada on a similar sort of rolling vacation as I was, and there was this almost instant chemistry between us that ended with me asking her out. We drank cheap Colombian beers, compared traveling tattoos. She definitely won with her traditional tippy-tap Filipino tribal piece, and generally just had ourselves a great time. But when it came to the end of the night, we were put in a rather precarious situation. You see, that old legacy of violence and suspicion means that in a city like Madeline, you can't get anywhere without the right credentials. And as a result, neither of us were allowed any guests in our respective hostels. So we thought on our feet and decided the night was warm enough for us to spend it in one of Madeline's public parks. So we spot what seemed like a nice enough place to lay down. Only as we're walking over, we see these 4 Colombian guys hanging out on a bench. No reason to be suspicious, right? I mean, it was a nice enough night, and the South American idea of a late night is totally different to ours, so not everyone hanging out past midnight is some kind of reprobate. I suppose that goes for the States too, but I digress. So me and Steph are sitting there for a few minutes when one of the guys from the bench comes over to talk to us. My Spanish is still an embarrassingly dire at that time, but I knew enough to know that he was asking for a cigarette. I told him, I don't smoke. No fumo, lo siento. But he carried on asking for stuff like money, then other things with words I didn't understand. I kept saying, lo siento, tengo nada. But he just won't give it up. He kept talking to us, then spits out something mean-sounding in Steph's direction. So at that point, I really take issue, and I have enough Dutch courage to tell him to get F before I leave Steph off to another spot further away from them. I'll spare you the finer details of what followed, but needless to say, Steph and I ended up having a little cuddle, shall we say, until we heard and saw something that almost scared us half to death. A police siren and flashing lights, and it was just a few feet away near the boundary of the parkland. Steph quickly pulled her dress back on, and we attempted to make ourselves as presentable as possible as the cop car screeches to a halt. 2 guys jump out, and they come jogging over to us. How they knew we were there, I don't know, but I figured the guy asking for smokes had called them and has a kind of screw you for not being generous to us. I'm on the verge of a full-on freakout, as all I can think is, I'm going to end up in a Colombian jail, and that's going to be the end of it for me. Colombia has some of the worst prisons in all of South America, and to no offense to our Latin cousins, but that's really saying something. What's worse, I didn't have the money to pay a fine or a bribe, so there was absolutely zero chance of me talking my way out of it. But still, I didn't really have a choice. The best I could hope for was to pull off a speech skill 100. So I got down to it. As this little Colombian cop, I don't even say that to be mean, the guy was literally no smaller than 5'4", is shining his flashlight in my face. I'm just pouring this stream of bilingual apologetic consciousness that probably sounded something like, "Dude, lo siento, seriously, no borrachos, han cansado, just tired, I'm sorry, I swear to God." What all the cop does is scold us in Spanish, talking so fast that I can barely understand a word. Steph is like welling up with tears at this point, as she's too obviously thinks she's about to be arrested. All I could do was shut up and let the cop burn off whatever angry energy he had, and just pray he didn't drag us both off to jail there and then. I just hit him with, "Lo siento, no entiendo," until he finally kinda calms down and pulls a smartphone out of his police vest thing. When I see he's pulling up Google Translate, I know something isn't quite right. If he really was just going to throw the cuffs on us, he'd have done it already, right? So what are we about to type out? I'd never forget what came next and how I foolishly tried to anticipate his words without stopping to consider the context. First thing he typed was translated, "These men," and pointed over to where the cigarette guy and his friends had been. I look over expecting to see them looking all smug, but there's no one there. And it dawns on me that they'd beat feet as soon as they'd seen the cops arrive. I go to say something like, "Yeah, I know, they called you, I'm sorry." But the cop cuts me off with a little sock puppet hand gesture, clamping the thing's mouth shut as if to stay quiet. So I do as I'm told and carry on watching him type. "These men," he continued, "are very dangerous. You must leave now or they will come back." And the cop stopped for a second, like he was trying to find the right words, then wrote, "They will come back and violate the girl. Understand?" My chin is dusting the floor at this point. Like I had no idea we were in that much danger. And right before I can say anything, the guy types, "They are known to us. They have done things before. They will do things again." Again, we just nod, too stunned by how dumb we'd been to really be relieved that we weren't in any trouble. The cop then types out, "Don't come back here during the night again," shows us the message, then escorts us to the well-lit street nearby. As you can imagine, that whole thing really killed the mood, and even though I walked Steph back to her hostel, there was never any talk of me getting inside to continue where we left off. I saw her a few more times before she moved on to Argentina, and yes, we did conclude some of the unfinished business, even kept in touch for a while after I returned to the US. But you can bet your bottom dollar I didn't go anywhere near any poorly lit places in Madeline, not for the remainder of my stay. I learned my lesson, and I learned it good.
For context, I am female and currently 21 years old, though at the time of this event I was 16 years old. I've never viewed myself as an attractive person. I've always been kind of chubby. I had bad acne in my teen years. I never cared at all what I wore, and I almost never wore makeup. I was an extremely awkward teen who had barely any friends and next to no self-esteem due to a very abusive relationship I had a few years prior, but that's a different story entirely. My point is that I was a completely different person during this time, and looking back, I know how naive I was and what I should have done instead to better protect myself. So it was the year 2015, and I was going on my very first cruise with my family. It was an 8 days, 7 nights cruise that was taking place a few days after a tsunami had passed nearby. After a rocky start, literally the boat rocked back and forth the first 2 days and everyone was miserable, and me suffering a slight panic attack during a routine evasion drill. I'm claustrophobic and really hate crowds. It ended up being one of the best weeks of my life, and I thoroughly enjoyed myself. Some of the downsides to this cruise was the fact that it was a North State cruise taking place in October, which meant chilly weather and no swimming, and because it was during a school year, I was the only guest my age on that cruise. The closest age to me, I think, was either 6 years old or 40 years old, So that kind of stunk, although I did end up crushing hard on our assistant dinner-time waiter who was around 30 years old and had the sweetest smile I'd ever seen. Anyways, time to get to the meat of the story. So as far as I know, most cruises have at least one formal night where everyone dresses up really nice for dinner and they serve special meals like lobster, steak, etc. As I said before, I wasn't the most attractive person out there, but I did doll myself up for this special occasion. I wore a turquoise knee-length dress, tan-colored high heels, my mom curled my blonde hair, and I put on some makeup that really made my blue eyes pop. I honestly did feel kind of pretty that night. Dinner was amazing and I finally got to try lobster tail for the first time. Loved it. I also, of course, made eyes and mildly flirted with our assistant waiter. I made him laugh because of how red my face would get whenever my dad called me out on it. So after our dinner, my family and I all decided to go our separate ways for the night. There was a bunch of events going on that each of us wanted to get to. Well, except for me, who spent most of the cruise finding random relaxing spots to sit and draw. I was, and have always been, an avid artist. So anyways, after a couple of hours, I decided I wanted to find my dad for some reason that I don't exactly remember. My mom had told me that he was going to the karaoke thing going on, so I started making my way around the ship, looking for wherever this was happening at. That's when I met him. I noticed him staring at me, and at first it was flattering. Like I said, I was average looking and had next to no self-esteem, so having anyone of the opposite sex look at me and smiling made me feel good. He looked to be not too much older than I was and was dressed in a cruise employee uniform, so I decided to approach him and ask if he knew where the karaoke room was. His smile never left as I asked him, and in a thick Indian accent he told me that he didn't know, but that we could search together for it. I thought it was a little weird at first that he was an employee but didn't know where an event was taking place, but I brushed it off and thought it was possible for some newer employees to not know where everything was yet. So he and I started walking around the ship together and casually chatted while doing so. He told me his name was Felix and was 21 years old. He also, as I suspected, did recently start working for this cruise liner a few months ago. For the record, I did find him kind of cute and liked how comfortable he felt talking to me about his life. As we continued walking around, he told me about how he was born and raised in India, how his family was kind of poor, how rooster fights were illegal back home, but he watched them anyways and stuff like that. I enjoyed listening to his stories about life in a different country, considering I've never been anywhere but America at this point in my life. We had eventually stopped looking for my dad and were just walking and talking together. We were now standing outside on the deck and leaning against the railing. I admired how beautiful and ominous the dark water reflected the stars. It was as if we were floating in the galaxy. It was completely beautiful. He then started telling me how lonely he was and how hard it is working on a cruise ship and watching hundreds of couples being romantic together while he has no one. I told him that I understood how he felt because I was also single and hated feeling alone. He looked at me and told me he was surprised that I don't have a boyfriend because of how beautiful I was. I blushed and looked away as I told him that most guys back home don't look at me twice, and he was surprised by that. You know that feeling when someone or something is behind you, and you can't see it, but you know you can sense it's there. Well, I felt something behind my head, and when I turned around to find out what it was, before I realized what was happening, Felix's face was right in mine, and he planted an unexpected kiss on me. I pulled back in surprise, and he asked me what I thought about it. I stuttered nervously and tried to think of a reply. Now, yes, I was a naive young person who was always looking positively at people, but I wasn't completely stupid. This was a 21-year-old stranger who was flirting with a 16-year-old girl. I also had the sudden realization that no one knew where I was or who I was with. Before I could even say anything, Felix started telling me how he knew of a couple of spots on this ship where we could be alone to do things together. I started panicking and really wanted to get away from him. Now, another fault of mine is that I'm way too nice for my own good, and I'm always afraid of hurting people's feelings or coming across as a mean person, even when I'm clearly in a dangerous situation. I'm still too friendly to everyone now, but nowadays, I have much more of a backbone and wouldn't have a problem telling someone like Felix to kindly screw off. But as I said, I didn't have that confidence back then, and I had no clue how to get out of the situation. Felix put his arm around my waist and started guiding me toward one of the areas he was talking about. I started stuttering. Maybe we shouldn't. We just met, and we might get caught, and you'd be in trouble, and my father might be looking for me. I know that sounds dumb, but I was trying to make him think of ways where this could be bad for him, so it seemed like I was trying to look out for him. Don't judge me too harshly. He told me not to worry about it because people mess around with staff sometimes and their boss never finds out. That only made me panic even more. He leaned in for another kiss, and I stupidly let him because I was scared of making him angry. After the long, uncomfortable kiss, I slightly turned away and told him I just wanted to keep looking at the night sky. He insisted that we should start messing around because we don't have much time together. I tried to hold back from crying at this point. And by the grace of the good Lord above, my phone suddenly made a noise, and I noticed my father had texted me asking where I was. I tried to mask my relief, but I immediately told Felix that I had to get going because my dad was wondering where I was and that he was very protective of me. Felix showed his disappointment to me saying that, but then he asked me for my phone number. My heart sank and I gave it to him. Again, stupid young female who doesn't know how to say no. I'm aware of how foolish that was. It was a good thing I didn't give him a fake, though, because he immediately texted my number to prove its authenticity. Once I thought he was satisfied, I started saying goodbye and walking away. He grabbed my wrists and spun me back toward him and asked for a hug goodbye first. I sheepishly agreed and gave him a light hug. I wanted to start crying when he squeezed me tight and pulled me against his groin and asked if I could feel it, if you know what I mean. I quickly stepped away and sped walked towards my hotel room. I made sure he didn't follow me, and once I was safely inside my room, I hopped on my bed and started crying. Of course, I couldn't tell my parents about this because I would be in trouble for putting myself in this situation, or so I thought. I promise my parents aren't really like that. I know now that in reality my former Marine father would have tracked Felix down and let him know to never touch his daughter again. A few minutes into my cry, and my phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number claiming it was Felix. I wanted to block him immediately, but again, stupidly, I was afraid that would anger him and he would somehow find me. So I answered him and we talked for a few minutes. We kept talking about how he wanted to see me again before I left the next day, which at this point I repeatedly thanked God for, and I kept telling him that it just wasn't possible because my parents didn't want me leaving my room for the rest of the night, which was a lie. I did eventually end up leaving my room and asked an older female employee where the karaoke event was, which she immediately took me to. Side note, the room was literally 2 hallways down from where I first found Felix, and I kicked myself for that later. I found my dad and didn't leave his side for the whole rest of the night. Luckily, I was able to enjoy the rest of my night dancing around with my father, and I did hide around him whenever I spotted Felix walking around, who was making it obvious that he was looking for me. I know the story isn't as scary as the most on here, but at the time, it was terrifying to me, and my own kindness could have got me into a very bad situation. The moral to my story is that everyone needs to be careful when going on cruises or other types of vacations. Just because someone wears an employee uniform doesn't mean they're trustworthy. There's many people out there who take advantage of kind people and want to use that against them. Just please make sure whoever you're with always knows where you are, and don't put yourself into risky situations.
Organized crime is possibly the greatest plague that human society has ever faced. It's a phenomenon that's developed organically throughout almost every culture and nation that's ever existed, from the thug cults of 13th century India to the Japanese Yakuza and the Russian Boers. It seems that certain sections of humanity are simply inclined towards criminality, and just like their law-abiding counterparts, they've found that coalition is often a superior choice to outright conflict. As we all know, the United States also has its fair share of organized crime, most often organized in the forms of New York's 5 families, Murder Incorporated, or perhaps the Crips and Bloods. But is it possible for smaller, less renowned, but more efficient forms of mafia to exist in 21st century America? And what if they took on some very unfamiliar, even comical new forms? Essentially what I'm asking, is there any such thing as a carnival mafia? I can hear some of you laughing already, picturing guys in clown outfits doing the whole Joe Pesci bit of funny. How am I funny? Do I amuse you? Am I serious? Deadly serious. So without further ado, let me tell you the story of Alfred and Pauline Carpenter. Alfred and Pauline loved the carnival. Our sunniest people sometimes call him, hailed from Oak Lawn in California, while Pauline was born in Walnut, Kansas. The couple were married on May 17th of 1986 in El Dorado, Kansas, and spent the next 32 years of their lives raising several loving children along the way. By all accounts, Pauline and are happiest when in each other's company, and many a photograph of the couple have shown just how in love they really were. After retiring from the aeronautical giant Boeing, where they both were employed, Al and Pauline made their living selling homemade jewelry at country fairs. And although it didn't exactly make them a mint, the nomadic lifestyle suited for the septuagenarian couple immensely. They were able to meet interesting new people while traveling the country they loved, and best of all, they got to do it together. This is how they ended up in Great Bend, Kansas on July 13th of 2018. During the Barton County Fair, it was a typical wholesome summer affair featuring an attractable Ferris wheel, a rabbit show, and a root beer float special. There were prizes for the best homegrown rhubarb stalks, green beans, and summer squash, along with a much-coveted trophy for the county's largest potato. Just like they have done many times before, Al and Pauline Carpenter set up their stall, arranged their goods in charming displays, and began friendly bartering sessions with the local townsfolk. The vast majority of the interactions were positive, but it's believed that at some point during the day, some kind of confrontation occurred between the Carpenters and their fellow carnival workers. At first glance, the confrontation doesn't seem to be too significant, as Al and Pauline continues to operate their stall until the end of the working day and simply retires to the RV for the evening. But as it turned out, the encounter would have deadly implications for them. 4 days later, on June 17th, the Van Buren Police Department received a rather distressing call from a woman who claimed her sister, Christine Tenney, was being held hostage. She went on to tell the dispatcher that 2 criminals had murdered a couple and stolen their RV, and were now holding her sister as a hostage at a residence known as the Vista Hill Apartments. Heavily armed police officers rushed to the apartment complex and were greeted by the sight of a large camper van with bullet holes in it. So far, the information was good, but just as they were in the process of locking the apartment complex down, who should they find alive and well but Christine Tenney? Christine was baffled by the reports of her kidnapping, claiming she was in no danger whatsoever. But when the parked RV was searched, police found trash bags full of bloody paper towels, blood-soaked clothing, and dispensed 9mm bullet casings. It was quite obvious that some kind of violent struggle, perhaps even murder, had taken place in the RV. And when the cops ran the vehicle's plate to discover who the owner was, R. Carpenter's name came back. Naturally, the police were very interested in talking to the person who had made the report in the first place. Given the hand the caller's sister, it was quite easy to track them down, and the person in question turned out to be a 52-year-old Florida woman named Kimberly Younger. Not only did Kimberly have a weak explanation as to why she thought her sister was in danger, chalking it up to a simple miscommunication, but she claimed that Al and Pauline Carpenter were just fine, and that she'd given them a ride to a casino in the hours before their RV was stolen. And then the cops noticed that Kimberly didn't seem to own a car. And when pressed as to what vehicle she'd used to give the Carpenters a ride, she claimed to have hired a car from a rental place that she couldn't remember the name of. Obviously, investigating officers found this to be highly suspicious, and they ordered the arrest of several carnival workers. When two of these carnival workers turned out to be none other than Christine Tanney and an ex-boyfriend of Kimberly Younger named Michael Fowler, police began to realize they were onto something. Then when Michael Fowler seemed to display an alarming amount of guilt during an interview, police applied the right amount of pressure, and he broke through tears of anguish and remorse. Fowler admitted to murdering the Carpenters, and is reported to have said, "She had me suckered the whole time. I just threw my whole life away. It was supposed to be my blood in," and police asked what he meant by blood, and they were well aware of the gangland connotations. But what kind of organization could this lowly carnival worker have been trying to enter after agreeing to cooperate with the authorities to avoid the death penalty? Fowler showed them the shallow graves in Arkansas where the Carpenters were buried, then went about telling them everything he knew. He claimed to have been in communication with a man named Frank as a chick, owner and operator of a Michigan-based traveling carnival company called Wade Shows Incorporated. But according to Michael Fowler, Frank had another, considerably more sinister occupation as leader of the carnival mafia. At some point during the question, Fowler got out his phone and showed police a series of Facebook messages purported to be between him and Frank Zane Chick. In one message at around 2:30 a.m. on July 14, Fowler had written, "It's done. They're dead. The job now gets out." Frank said Chick replied, "I'm trying to calm down right now." Fowler wrote back, "Deep breaths." Read Z Chick's response, "The first is always the hardest." Jen sent me pictures of the man I sent on to the heads of council wars over. Police tried tracking Z Chick down and were successful in finding a Michigan carnival operator by the same name. But Z Chick denied having any knowledge of the killings and categorically denied that there was any such thing as the carnival mafia, as a shake went on to say that it didn't know the alleged suspects or the victims. As far as he could recall, they had never been employed by Wade Show Incorporated. He was quick to add that he had no idea why they would use his name. It's kind of bone-chilling. And he said, "I'd like to talk to the cops about it, but no one's reached out. I'm a solid citizen. I have nothing to hide." And Wade Shows has a wonderful reputation as a chick who went on to deny ownership to the Facebook account that was in communication with a murderer, even though it included several seemingly intimate photographs of him. All the cops had to do was establish a concrete link between Z-Chick and the killer, and they had a solid murder case. But then, just a few days later, Kimberly Junger contacted the police with a jaw-dropping confession. She claimed to have set up a false Facebook account and had been posing as Frank Z-Chick in order to trick her ex-boyfriend into murdering the Carpenters. She seemed desperate to absolve a chick of all culpability and assured police that she and she alone was responsible for ordering the Carpenters' death. It's also possible that they were she who revealed the involvement of the 37-year-old Texas man named Rusty Frazier Ratio, is said to have facilitated the murders in some manner, possibly by others supplying the weapon or aiding in the disposal of the bodies. It's not clear if Rusty Frazier was working the Barton County Fair around the time that the Carpenters were killed, but his ability to quickly transport the remains out of the state suggests that there may be an even wider network of people who had a hand in the murders. Most of those arrested vehemently denied the existence of any kind of carnival mafia and insisted they acted alone.
Michael Fowler later retracted his statement about it being blood-in-style initiation and insisted he simply had been tricked as part of a petty personal rivalry. Kimberly Younger had also spoken of a kind of carny mafia and gave the police some rather detailed stories of how they laundered money, collected protection money, and murdered anyone who refused to cooperate. Is she to retract her statement after the police investigated Frank Zanechick's role in the murders? It's almost as if, though they've been warned to shut their mouth or face the consequences. Officially, law enforcement in both Kansas and Arkansas have stated that there is no carnival mafia. Maintaining the concept is nothing more than the frantic fabrication of two murder suspects. But at the same time, there has never been any conclusive explanation as to why the Carpenters were murdered. It's often explained the way as a disagreement or confrontation that suddenly turned violent. But even so, the root cause of the conflict had never been accounted for. Could it be that the argument arose of the Carpenters' refusal to pay protection money? And were the Carpenters killed so that the Carnival Mafia could make an example out of them, if the official statement of the police is to be believed? And now, it's all just crazy coincidence? Frank Zanechick's name was picked because he's the wealthy owner of several successful fairgrounds. But until the root cause of the confrontation is confirmed, until we have an actual concrete motive for the Carpenters' murders, there's still room to wonder, is there really such a thing as the Carnival Mafia?
You might be able to describe 17-year-old David Faraday as the all-American boy. David was clean-cut, a good student, and a member of the Boy Scouts of America. He was also apparently something of a moral arbiter, having once confronted a marijuana dealer outside of his high school when the man had apparently been attempting to peddle the drug to members of the student body. After threatening to inform the police, the dealer was said to never have hung around the high school again. And although by today's standards we might consider this to be so-called snitch behavior, David was clearly simply trying to protect his fellow students from something he was concerned would affect their academic performance. He was a good person, with a good heart, and almost all of what he did came from a place of love. But like many boys his age, David found himself increasingly interested in the opposite gender. And there was one particular young lady that caught his attention over all others. Betty Lou Jensen was 16, a year younger than David, but she was incredibly popular and her reputation as a charming, well-mannered young lady preceded her. She was also a very talented artist who took a great deal of interest in all things creative. It was at a local youth function that David got the chance to talk to Betty Lou, and his affection for her seemed to be entirely reciprocated. Betty Lou shared a great deal with him and even invited him to visit her after school so that he could walk her home. After a few weeks of wholesome teenage dating, something of a relationship began to blossom between the two bright-eyed young people. But all was not entirely well, as there was another boy who had his eye on Betty Lou, one who was not about to let David have her all to himself. He squared up to David when the young man was waiting outside of Betty Lou's high school. And although the confrontation didn't become physical, some pretty harsh insults were exchanged and David was warned to stay away from his new girlfriend. Other boys might have been deterred by such a display of possessiveness and aggression, but not David. He was determined to secure his place as the only boy in Betty Lou's life, and so one afternoon on their way home from school, David asked Betty if she'd like to go on a date with him, their first date, and to his absolute elation, Betty Lou said yes. David racked his brain for a solid first date idea, and given that it was late December, decided that a great way to capture that festive romantic spirit would be to take Betty Lou to a local Christmas event. And being the gentleman that he was, he made a promise to her parents to have her back home by 11 p.m. at the very latest. Rumor has it that David and Betty were planning on attending the Christmas-themed party with a few other local high school students. But perhaps this was simply a cover to reassure the young girl's parents, because what we know for certain is that they ended up driving over to Lake Herman Road in David's Rambler station wagon, parking it up in quite a well-known spot that was known to many as Lover's Lane. The whole appeal of the spot near Lake Herman is that it was quiet and unfrequented by members of the public, hence why young couples might use it to gain some privacy for certain unsavory activities. But it wasn't just infatuated lovebirds who noted the location's seclusion, because someone else wished to take advantage of the isolation for something that was considerably more malicious. At some point during their stay up on Lover's Lane, David and Betty Lou noticed another car pull into the spot, one that parked up alongside them before turning its lights off. At first, David and Betty were worried it was the cops, come to arrest them for committing lewd acts in public. But as they peered through the darkness to study the vehicle next to them, it became increasingly obvious that it was not in fact the police. All the young couple could do was watch, growing increasingly scared as the shadowy silhouette in the front seat stayed statue still, staring at them through the passenger's window. Betty Lou told David she was spooked and asked him to see if he could get the person to leave. But unlike previous encounters where David's bravery had shone through when confronted with a source of maliciousness, he too was far too frightened to do anything. But as he prepared to start up the Rambler's engine so he could drive Betty Lou out of there, the driver of the other vehicle got out and approached David's side of the Rambler. David was transfixed, frozen in fear like a deer in a car's headlights, but when he saw the mysterious stranger pull out a pistol and aim it at his window, his flight response kicked into gear. Betty threw open the passenger side door, throwing herself from the Rambler before David followed suit, but neither kid was fast enough to outrun a bullet. The stranger fired once through the roof of the Rambler, then sprinted around the back to fire another shot at David through the vehicle's rear window. Both shots hit the young man, and he crawled along the ground near the station wagon's back wheel on the passenger side, trying and failing to escape. Betty Lou, however, began to sprint away through the darkness as the first shots were fired, but the stranger was fast. He took aim and fired 5 shots at the right side of her back, each bullet striking her torso before she fell. As she lay dying in the darkness, the killer turned his attentions back to David, pointing the pistol towards his head and pulling the trigger one last time, sending a bullet crashing into his skull just behind his left ear. Apparently, the killer then simply got back into his car and drove away into the night. Sometime later, someone who drove past the spot on Lover's Lane must have seen the bodies lying in the dirt, and then rushed to call the police. David was still breathing when they arrived on the scene, but was completely unresponsive, and was dead on arrival when he was finally taken to a nearby hospital for treatment. The double homicide stunned and horrified the local community, and rumors abounded that there was a crazed, firearm-wielding madman on the loose, with it only being a matter of time before they struck again. One of the first people contacted by the police as a potential suspect in the murders was the young man who had confronted David as a result of his own jealousies over his and Betty Lou's blossoming relationship. But it was discovered that this young man had a strong alibi for his whereabouts, meaning there was no way he could have been the mysterious bloodthirsty stranger who pulled into Lover's Lane that night. As the summer of 1969 drew to a close, journalists and law enforcement alike wondered if the teenage lover's killer would ever be found, but little did they know that the nightmare had just began, and what would follow would continue to baffle all those involved for decades to come. Because the man who took David and Betty Lou's lives that evening, the man who relentlessly fired bullet after bullet into the Rambler station wagon, would come to be known by a name that would echo through the annals of true crime all over the world: the Zodiac. Zodiac's identity remains a complete mystery even to this day. The killer's nickname originated from a series of taunting letters and cards sent to the San Francisco Bay Area press. These letters included 4 cryptograms based around a number of ciphers, one of which was recently solved by the FBI after over 50 years of research and study. We know for certain that the Zodiac murdered 5 people in Benicia, Vallejo, Napa County, and San Francisco in the 11 months spanning December of 1968 and October of 1969. It seems he preferred to target young couples, which is how he seemed to have come across David and Betty Lou while the pair were on their first date. Yet despite only 5 confirmed victims being attributed to the Zodiac, he once claimed to have murdered 32 other people, bringing his total body count to 37 victims. A killing spree that started with 2 young lovers, so excited to finally have some time alone together on their first date, never being able to imagine that it would end in such a brutal moment of painful finality. So the next time you're on a first date, don't be so quick to go somewhere secluded, as you never know who might be watching or following, just ready to turn a perfect romantic moment into a living nightmare.
Now, I have a story to share that has really traumatized me for quite a while now, and I feel this is a good place to share it. So I'm from New Zealand, and over there we have the odd missing person or scary murder case, but it's otherwise safe here and not much goes on. I mean that in a way that as a 19-year-old girl, I feel comfortable to walk the streets at night or go on hikes alone, and everyone looks out for one another generally. This happened in the summer of 2019, and my boyfriend and I were headed out on a picnic date to a spot we had visited many times before, called Karakariki Track. It's at the end of a very long, windy and rural farm road off of the state highway, so you drive for about 15 to 20 minutes from the main road down a long farm stretch, and at the end is a large cul-de-sac and a massive surrounding farm. The owners of the farm have left the land kind of open to the public as a reserve, because there are native trees and other things, and because about a 15-minute walk from the cul-de-sac car park there's a small waterfall you can go swimming in. The track is really popular, as it's one of the closest swimming spots to the nearest city, which is Hamilton, and it's really scenic and beautiful. You can cross footbridges and pass by creek beds, etc., and the farmers still go through every now and then to do their work, but there are fenced-off areas that the public can't enter too, as they still actively work the land. So this particular day, my boyfriend and I were really happy, because the parking lot was empty and it was a super hot summer's day, which was really rare. We saw the farmer crossing with his cows through the gate on a quad as we arrived, and he smiled and waved at us. He was an older man, and we had spoken before as we were regular visitors. So we set off towards the waterfall and crossed one footbridge and passed through a big paddock of cows. Now the track is quite narrow, and the creek is right next to it down a bank, so you have to be careful. We saw the waterfall, decided against swimming as we had no towels, and headed back towards the car park. On our way back, we decided to go down a little bit of a steep gravel off-ramp from the track that led to a more private tree-covered area right by the creek. We were kissing and whatnot, and I was laying on my tummy, reading a book, as my boyfriend was sitting up playing on his phone, rubbing my back and playing with my hair. We were there for about 10 minutes, before I turned and glanced up the gravel path. Way up, even further on a hill through one of the farmer's gates, I saw a big man on a quad bike who I didn't recognize as one of the farmers, as there's only an old couple who work the land. But he was just sitting there, staring at my boyfriend and I. I don't even want to think about how long he had been there before we'd noticed, so I told my boyfriend what I could see, making him turn to look too. As soon as the guy saw we were both looking at him, he opened the gate and started heading down towards us. We immediately got up to leave, as we didn't want to have a conversation with a farmer about us getting freaky on his land, which is what we both assumed would happen. But it was so much worse. This guy came down the gravel track and ran his quad right through the creek. He then left it there running in the water and got off. He was talking to himself, saying things along the lines of, I messed my quad and I've damaged my engine. over and over before he even got anywhere near us. My boyfriend and I were gathering our things to leave at this point when he began to head towards us. He didn't even make small talk, which was really strange, because he went straight into saying, "Have you guys seen any fish? I'm looking for some fish to kill." My boyfriend told the guy that there was no fish in the creek as it's fresh water, and that he was probably best off to catch some eel. This sent him into a fit, and he said, "I don't want no effing eel. I want to kill some fish." I had made it a point not to look the guy in the eyes, as I didn't want to draw the conversation towards myself, because I was already extremely freaked out and didn't want him to notice. My boyfriend was much more of the calm and strong one when it came to stuff like this. But for a second I did look at the guy, and I thought it looked like his face was slightly deformed. I thought maybe Bell's palsy. As I work in aged care, I've seen it a bit and it looked similar. I bent down to tie my shoelace, and as I stood back up, that's when I noticed a pistol on this man's waist. Now listen to me closely. This is the first and last time in my entire life I have ever seen a real-life gun, as it's incredibly hard to get a firearm in New Zealand, especially after the regulations following the mass shooting in Christchurch. And not only that, he had one pistol on his belt and was waving another one about in his hand as he talked to my boyfriend about wanting to kill some fish. He was aiming it down to the creek every now and again, then swinging it around on his finger. My boyfriend gave me this stern look, and stern is the best word for it, because the look spoke a million words to me in that moment, and he nodded his head towards the gravel hill leading back to the track. I grabbed the 2 bags we had, fake-checked my phone and told the man that our family were waiting for us back at the car park. He completely ignored what I had said though, and instead said, "That's a cool hat you've got on," or something along those lines that were completely irrelevant. So I dismissed myself, said goodbye, and made my way to the hill. In my mind, I didn't want to look back and see that my boyfriend had been shot and then a gun at my own head. I knew that our best bet was me getting up this hill onto the narrow path where he couldn't ride his quad and sprint towards the farmer's house. As I was walking up the hill, this guy said to my boyfriend, "That's a really pretty girl you've got there." It was like all the intentions of his that I didn't want to believe were just then confirmed. I actually felt like I was going to die. My boyfriend, though, said a quick, "Thank you, we'll be off now," and headed up the hill with me. The guy kept talking, though, like the conversation hadn't ended, even as we headed away. He just stood there, gun in hand, and watched us leave. As soon as we were around the corner, we sprinted all the way back to the car park, where there were over 10 empty gun shells. We hadn't noticed this before. We had run into 2 girls in bikinis arriving at the spot, and informed them about the guy and everything that had just happened, so they got in their cars and left immediately. We tried to go to the farmer's house to ask if he knew the guy, as we'd never seen him on the land before, but they weren't home anymore. And as for the gun, it's still really freaky to me, as I'd never seen one before. But the pistols the guy had looked quite old and rusty, and when we discussed the incident on the way home, my boyfriend suggested they were probably handed down to him from someone else. This incident has stuck with me for the past few years, and my boyfriend and I have not been able to return to that spot again, which really sucks, because that's where we had our first date and it meant a lot to us. I had to drive past the road leading to the track for about a year too, as I commuted between towns, and it always made me feel sick. I could have lost my life or my partner that day, or so much worse, and I'm always extremely grateful that my boyfriend is the man that he is and was able to steer the guy away from us for us to leave. To communicate to me through movement to tell me what to do in my freaked out state too. He told me afterwards that he was ready to die if he had to, because knowing the guy had been watching us beforehand and complimented me in the way that he did, was clear that he could have had some scary intentions. It's also made me way more fearful now to travel in the bush alone, which I've done my whole life.
I had a stalker in secondary school. Well, not quite the follow you everywhere and make a shrine out of your hair kind of stalker, but enough to make me feel afraid for my safety on an almost daily basis. It made for a fairly terrifying 2 years before my mom got married and we moved to the complete other side of London. He was this huge rugby player, very handsome and extremely popular, so of course there were absolutely no social repercussions for him, and people basically refused to believe that he'd pay any attention to me at all, let alone anything remotely abusive. When he started obsessing over me, most everyone brushed it off or made excuses for him, but it quickly became an absolute nightmare. He was always making comments towards me, pinching or pulling my hair when no one else was looking. It was creepy because he obviously didn't want anyone to really know what he was doing. He knew it was disturbed, and he knew it would make him look bad if it all came to light. Sometimes he'd say things like, "I can smell you. You're about to be on your period," or "nice and clean," always in the creepiest, perviest way imaginable, as if it couldn't get more obvious that he was enjoying it. One of the scariest moments I can recall is when I was scanning the vending machine one morning before class trying to figure out what to have for breakfast. He came up behind me, placed his hands on my waist, pushed me right up against the machine and said very clearly in my ear, "One day, I'm going to kidnap you, take you to the forest, tie you up, and screw you until you want it." That was 3 weeks before our move date, and the only thing that stopped me from going to the head teacher was the fact that it wouldn't be long until I never had to deal with this guy ever again. But I now know that that was the complete wrong approach. Even if you manage to escape someone like that, they just pick a new victim, and another, and another. They only stop victimizing women when they're actually confronted by authority figures, and even then they might be psycho enough to just carry on. So please, if anything like this happens to you, report it to the relevant authorities. Even school staff take stuff like that really, really seriously and won't hesitate to get the police involved if they think that's the right course of action.
I used to work for the Chico County Sheriff back in the mid-90s. Chico really in the middle of nowhere, the poorest place in the entire state of Arkansas. But when I was a deputy, there was never more than about 10,000 people in the entire county. It was and still is the kind of place that people drive through without a second thought. But I thought about Chico a whole lot. I think about it every day. Sometimes it's all I can think about, no matter how much booze I sink or how many pills I take. And back in the fall of '96, Chico started to become flooded with a kind of low-grade crystal methamphetamine that was called crank or biker meth. High-grade meth forms crystals, hence the name, but the low-quality stuff is just a powdery white substance that can burn up the user's throat because of the stuff it's cut with. We were finding that junk everywhere. It was decimating the poor folks out there. It was in the schools and the bars, even in the churches. We arrested this one kid who'd been awake all weekend and had sat there twitching in the pews until the collection plate came around. Didn't even care that people saw him take the money either, and was too messed up to even have any means of a getaway. Violent crime skyrocketed in the space of about 4 months. Things were getting out of control. We were picking up tweakers from all over that were making pilgrimages to Chico just to spend their money on the cheapest, dirtiest crystal we at the department had ever seen. I put cuffs on guys from Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, even as far away as Indiana. The county sheriff even got a call from the governor, who demanded something be done about it all. And as you can imagine, all that fecal matter rolled straight downhill. But we had no idea where this stuff was coming from. Anyone we picked up for selling wouldn't talk about who they got it from, no matter what we threatened them with. And they were like crystal commandos. And from my experience, that's just not like tweakers to cover for each other. They'll do anything to stay out of jail, because it usually means a forced detox. But these dealers, they kept their mouths shut, like they were full-blood mafia. like Crystal Nostra or something. Like they were more scared of the guy selling it to them than they were of us. We bagged one guy with 6 pounds of the stuff, and it was me that drove him over to the county for booking. Afterward, I went back to my car, and there was all this might have caked onto the floor and into the back seats, my cruiser. I mean, it was everywhere. I smelled real bad, and I was livid that he had made such a freaking mess. But then it hit me. All that mud had come from somewhere, right? By the looks of it, we managed to bag the guy just as he gotten the re-up from his connection. So wherever the sky just came from was muddy, real muddy, like maybe somewhere out near the Mississippi or one of the lakes out here in Chico. I decided to take a drive just to see what I could see. Maybe a little walk to have a feeling took me besides. What's the worst that could happen? I found our crystal cooks and brought them in for the big win. Well, as it turns out, that actually was the worst thing that could happen afterwards. I never be the same again. I spent a lot of time fishing with my pa when I was a kid. That's pretty much all there was to do in Chico, a county of over 40 separate lakes and reservoirs, and I've been to almost all of them. Most of the shorelines are shale or sandy soil, but one particular shoreline is pure mud when you're going to lose your shoes in if you don't have the foresight to wear rubber boots. And it has the infinitely creative but descriptive name of Mud Lake. And it was Mud Lake that I decided to take a drive to that afternoon. The lake itself isn't too popular with fishermen, not unless you're looking for some monster catfish, and those things can be much more trouble than they're worth reel in, so has some trace in the edge of his own foot. I thought it was pretty strange to see a trail of smoke wafting up through some trees around the other side. I mean, was faint, real faint, and maybe if the wind had been blowing just a little, I didn't never seen it at all. But it was eerily still that day and just as quiet. It took me about 20 to 30 minutes of walking, but I traced the edge of the lake, right around to the rough area, could see the smoke. The closer I got to the source, the more I began to smell this disgusting, putrid stench, almost like a mix of rotten eggs and cat urine. I almost noticed that patches of what would have otherwise been healthy plant life had started to die, like whatever I was closing in on was death itself. How no life could survive near it. I thought about turning back a few times, but eventually came across when I was only described as a suit, use of wood panel and corrugated iron shacks. I know I should have called out to see if anyone was home or announced myself as a deputy and demand that whoever was inside should come out. But the feeling of dread in the pit of my stomach just seemed to stop any words from coming out of my mouth. Cops don't go by the book all the time, especially not small-town deputies like me. Besides, I couldn't hear anything coming from inside any of the shacks. And aside from the small campfire burning in a clearing between the shacks, there were little signs of human inhabitation. See, I push open the door to one of the shacks with my .44 drawn, and immediately recoil at the fumes that come out. And never actually seen a working meth lab before, but I didn't need any narcotic expert to tell me that's exactly what I'd just seen. There was all kinds of trash strewn around in their discarded packaging, from cold medicine, batteries that had been cut open, used coffee filters, and what wasn't included, all the improved glassware set up on the small table that I had heard stories about how bad they'd smell from all the chemicals being mixed up in them, which must have been where that cat pee smell was coming from, and backed off from the shack, coughing and sputtering, feeling nauseous with my eyes streaming. I felt awful, but at the same time, kind of elated. I was almost certain that I had found our meth cook. It was only when I searched the other shacks that I began to feel really freaked out. The first one was evidently some kind of sleeping area. The 2 camping cots set up on either side of the shack. The only thing was, they didn't look used at all. They were covered in the same kind of trash that was strewn about the lab shack. Gas canisters, tubes of what looked like rock chemical ingredients. Whoever used those shacks obviously didn't sleep much, if at all. There were also rows of dollar bills all over the place. These guys weren't taking care of the profits at all, it seemed. Either they were making too much money to account for it all, or money just didn't matter to them. And that was a terrifying prospect to me. Whoever was flooding Sheikah with crank wasn't doing it for the cash. They were doing it for some other reason entirely. But it was the things that were written on the wood wall panels that really got my attention. All kinds of weird phrases and symbols have been scrawled on the walls in what appeared to be black marble pen. Stuff and chicken scratch handwriting so bad I could barely make any of the words out that were interspersed with skulls, difficult looking things, and little black stars. I backed out of the second shack and went to check on the third, which was by far the worst one of all. There was another rotten smell coming from behind a flimsy wooden door, but this one was from something very different to a meth lab. And when I peeked inside, I almost puked from how bad it was. Surrounded by yet more piles of trash and money was a big old wooden stake that looked like it had been driven into the ground as deep as it could possibly go, and tied to that wooden stake was the most mutilated dead body I'd ever seen in all my years of police work. Whoever it was had been dead for a while, but they hadn't completely decomposed yet, and there were so many flying insects and maggots crawling all over their face and body that at first it kind of looked like they were moving. I'm not sure how much damage had been inflicted while they were still alive, and I pray that most of the mutilation had been done post-mortem. But the look of agony of the corpse's face made that almost impossible to imagine. The poor soul that had been tied to that stake had been scalped, had one of their eyes removed, had teeth pulled, fingers cut off with the stumps looking like they'd been cauterized to stop them from bleeding too much. There was deep, dark-looking patterns of cuts across their face that suggested that they'd been carved up in a kind of ritualistic way while they were still alive. The same kind of black burn marks on their finger stumps were present on the torso and thighs, to looking almost like cigarette burns, but like they'd been inflicted by something bigger. There were many other wounds on the body that would have required a coroner to really be able to tell how they were inflicted. But one thing was clear to me. Whoever this was had been tortured, maybe even to death. Then read his "I'm about to turn around the head" back to my cruiser and radio the whole thing in. I hear something moving through the trees behind me. I spin around to see the filthiest backwoods monster I'd ever seen, just walking through the trees in nothing but boots, a pair of urine-stained white briefs, a shin holster with what looked like a hunting knife tucked into it, and a gas mask. He had some kind of AR variant slung over his shoulder too, but luckily I had my .44 trained on him before he could react and reach for it. I told him not to move, right, put it down, and at first he starts raising his hands nice and slow. All I could see of his face was the cold, dead gaze that stared back at me through the misty clear plastic eye holes of his gas mask. There was just nothing behind them, like they were a doll's eyes or something alive but non-alive. Man, I heard something move behind me, and I figured it must have been his partner or whoever the second camping cot belonged to. And for just a second, I was dumb enough to give this guy my back out of fear that his partner was trying to sneak up on me. But it must have been a possum or something running through the woods, because there was nothing there when I turned. And by the time I looked back, the guy in the gas mask was unsoldering his rifle and preparing the fire. I let off 3 shots at him, and I'm pretty sure I missed every one. In return, he let off an automatic burst of his rifle that ripped up the shacks behind me, and somehow, either from the poor vision of his mask or the recoil of the rifle, managed to miss me to Nixon, I know. I'm running through the trees, trying to see the trunks cover in between, looking for a solid position to return fire. I can hear the sky barking like a rabid dog while he's chasing me, and I fire 3 more shots in a running gun battle that leaves my .44 empty. He replies with another burst of his rifle, and although it didn't feel like I'd been hit right away, I suddenly found I wasn't able to run anymore. Like I suddenly lost all feeling in my right shin. A human makes this mudded whipping sound like he must have seen me go down and realized one of those shots that hit the mark. But from the lack of follow-up fire, I figured that he too must have been out of ammo. I didn't see any spare magazine on him, and he was half naked after all. But he didn't have the knife on him, and I could hear him hollering about how he was going to use it on me as he took off after me through the trees. The whole time, I'm reloading my .44. I'm thinking about the state of the body back there in the third shack and how he'd have all the time in the world to work me over. Just as I'm assuming he had done to the poor soul that was tied to the stake, that was the most afraid I'd ever been in my entire life. Every single other emotion pales in comparison to the intensity of that fear. I was shaking so bad I could barely load my revolver. Even with the speed loader, I could barely manage it, but somehow I did. Rolling once my back and aiming just in time to see the monster coming through the trees, me with his knife in hand, I pull all 6 bullets into him, and then watch them collapse into the dirt like a sack full of rocks. It wasn't over though. I still had to crawl back through the mud and the blood to my cruiser, and I had to sneak past the cook's dead body in order to do so. The whole time I'm crawling past him, I was expecting his eyes to just open suddenly like a horror movie or something, for him to roll onto my back and plunge that hunting knife into my neck. While I was trying to crawl away, every second was drawn out of my heart racing as I tried to keep one eye on the guy and one eye ahead of me. But he didn't wake up. No one just gets up after taking 644 slugs to the chest. I was retired on medical grounds not long after. Doc said the bullet that hit me fractured when I hit the shin bone, and there's been a piece of lead still stuck in my right leg ever since, meaning I now walk with a permanent limp. But that's just the physical scarring of what I went through that day. Sometimes, I think the mental after effects have been way worse. I barely slept a wink for months. And if I actually did manage to drift off after drinking myself into a stupor, the nightmares would be enough to have me waking up screaming, having soaked the bed sheets with cold sweat. I got so bad that my wife couldn't sleep in the same bed as me until hours upon hours of therapy sessions gave me some small measure of closure. I thought for a while she might divorce me, because the man that came back from Mud Lake just wasn't the same as the one that drove out there. I'm doing much better now. Me and the wife are still strong together, and we live down in Florida quite comfortably thanks for the compensation I got from the government. I got a Medal of Valor from them for something most guys would keep on display somewhere, but I keep that thing locked away in a drawer. I figure maybe if I write something like this, it might help process what happened back at Mud Lake, thinking that it might help me get past it. My therapist thought it might not be a good idea, and I told him I'd rather just forget. But I know that it's not possible that the memories of Mud Lake will stay with me until I'm as dead as the cook in his gas mask.
Three men in black robes and Tyler, who was sitting on the ground. I hesitated to enter, but I gathered the courage and went ahead. After I reached there, I asked Tyler, "What's all this about? And who are these people?" "They will help bring back Layla," Tyler answered. Those men were silent the whole time, and Tyler told me that he missed Layla and he saw my Instagram post and called the number below the note. I was scared and shocked, so I tried to run away. When I turned back, I saw a corpse lying on the ground. Due to extreme fear and shock, I had lost my voice for a few moments, and my whole body was shaking and trembling with fear. It was Layla's dead body that I saw. Before I could do anything, someone knocked me down, and I started to lose consciousness. That's when I saw Tyler dragging Layla's corpse back to the grave. He said, "Necromancer, please bring back my girlfriend. I brought you the sacrifice." One of the masked men came forward and said something in his ear. The other two attacked Tyler from behind. I lost consciousness, and Tyler was probably knocked down too. When I came to my senses, I was in a truck, and my hands and legs were tied. I saw Tyler was in a similar situation as me. He was bleeding from his forehead. My head was hurting so much, and I was struggling to free my hands and feet. Tyler regained consciousness as well. The truck stopped, and I heard the sound of footsteps coming toward us. I whispered to Tyler, "Close your eyes, and don't let them know you're awake." We acted as if we were unconscious. A man came and checked on us, and then he called the other man using abusive language. They put us on a stretcher and took us inside a building. That place was cold and smelled like medicine, and I figured out what was going on. We were taken to the operation room, and a doctor came to perform surgery on us. They were preparing for the surgery, and judging from their conversation, I knew they were going to extract our organs. I heard the police siren coming from a distance, and all the people around us started to run away. When I opened my eyes, a police officer came and asked me, "Are you okay, miss? Can you walk?" I said, "Yes, I'm okay." I went outside and looked for Tyler. He was sitting near an ambulance getting first aid for his injury. After getting examined by a doctor and giving my statement to the police, I was escorted home by them. On our way home, they told me that the group known as Necromancer was actually a group of grave robbers, and he did all that to uncover the organ trafficking that was going on in that hospital. When he contacted him, they called Tyler to the cemetery and dug Layla's grave. They asked him to sacrifice a living girl in order to bring his girlfriend back. He figured out that these people are behind the grave robbery and organ trafficking. Tyler apologized to me for putting my life in danger. I forgave him, but after that day, I never talked to him again.
Relationships could be complicated in ways that one cannot imagine. There are moments when you are ready to kill for your better half, and then there are moments where you want to kill your better half. Almost everyone at some point have thought of killing somebody, but it is another thing to think about it and completely different thing to actually do that and go on and kill. The curious case of Courtney Cleaney is somewhat of a case that is incredibly terrifying, not because there are monstrosities or barbaric or anything supernatural about it, but because it is real and could happen to anyone at any given point in life. Especially when you are in relationship and the relationship is taking a toxic toll upon your life. Then there are certain moments that will lead you to take irrational steps that are damaging in many ways, and in so many ways can prove themselves to be fatally harmful for people on both sides. In the video, you are seeing a young OnlyFans model, Courtney Cleaney. She is a young model who have been developing a name on this site OnlyFans and putting herself out there and making a good living for herself. Now, if you are someone who gets paid in a lot of money for your single photograph, there is a rare chance that someone in a relationship with a higher paying girl would get insecure. And with the OnlyFans thing and her being intimate in front of all of these men who are paying to get her sexual photographs now, there is something that would piss off a lot of men. So here in the video, Courtney Cleaney is drenched in blood and sitting beside the body of her boyfriend Obumsely, which seems to not be moving. From this shaky video that the neighbor have seemed to film, we can see Courtney in her lingerie, confused and devastated, and in blood. At this point, no one knows the events that led up to this massacre, but it is something to speculate upon. On Sunday, April 3rd, in a small shaky video, an OnlyFans model Courtney Cleaney has been sitting and soaked in blood that was of Christian Toby Obumsely. Nobody knows what happened in that room before. Nobody. But Courtney. Their relationship had been that of more than 2 years, and the people who were witness to their relationship consider it to be a toxic relationship, and it was something that everyone warned them about. Imagine being a 25-year-old model, making a lot of money from OnlyFans, but there are a lot of theories of how things must have gone by that evening, and a lot of speculations and facts about the case. But the truth only remains intact with 2 people. One of them is Obumsely, who is very dead right now, and the other one is Courtney, and you never know how much of the truth she will disclose. Well, here is our version, how things might have gone. One fine day, when the tensions were high, Obumsely must have come back to the apartment asking for Courtney and asking her what her plans with the life was, if OnlyFans was the only thing that she would ever ambition her about. A man insecure about her girlfriend is not something new, especially when her girlfriend is getting paid to be pretty lewd in front of strangers that nobody knows. Are you always going to earn money from sharing your naked photographs? Must have said Obumsely, to which she just shrugged her shoulders too and went on to doing the photograph for OnlyFans. And then he must have said, "Do not ignore me when I am talking to you." Knowing that the relationship was toxic, these fights must have been frequent and normal. But this time, something was definitely different, as he said, "Look at me when I am talking to you." He shouted as he grabbed her by the shoulders and pushed her away. And enraged, Obumsely must have had enough and his violent senses taking over. He must have charged over at Courtney and punched her. As he did that, Courtney tried to get away from him, but he was wild and like an angry werewolf, charged at her. And as she ran to the kitchen countertop, she grabbed the knife. And as he was attacking her, she tried ducking away. And as she did in her self-defense, the knife pierced its way to his chest. And in return, Obumsely getting stabbed in the chest. Distraught, Courtney tried reviving him. Knowing that she was not able to, she called in the 911. And as she sat beside Obumsely, drenched in blood, and waiting for the police to arrive, she was both in shock and in sorrow. Even if the relationship was toxic, there was no way they would really be drastic and act in something of murder. Then, there is the version where Obumsely was the innocent guy, and Courtney murdered out for blood. Hear what might have happened. Upon further looking into the matter of Courtney and OnlyFans, he might have stumbled through the affair, or affairs she might have been having. He must have come in to confront her. "Are you having an affair?" he must have asked. And then upon not getting any answer, he continued, "Just let me know the truth. I don't want to be played with." And then she must have continued to do what she was doing. And as she did, Obumsely confronted her with evidence and said, "These are all the men that you are having an affair with." He continued in rage, "Answer me. What is wrong with you? Just tell me." And as he asked her and questioned her, she came in with rage with all those questions and said, "I am having an affair and they pay well, unlike you." And as she did, she turned into this fierce psycho lady and charged him with a knife and stabbed him in the chest. And as she did, she saw the blood oozing and applied it to her body, sat around, took a rest, and started crying, and then called the police. Now, the truth can be anything, but at this point, with no information, we can just assume. Courtney walked free out of the court on the basis that she acted in self-defense. Was it self-defense that can only be uncovered by Courtney and Obumsely? So, his word is something that we definitely cannot seem to get. What is more concerning is if the tables were turned and it was Obumsely who acted in self-defense, would he have walked free?
For the past 6 years, I've worked as a college campus police officer. We're a branch of law enforcement that doesn't get very much publicity or attention from the general public, but we're just as much law enforcement as any other branch. Policing college campuses is pretty much all I've ever known, too, because before I trained to be a regular cop, I worked as a campus security officer, which, trust me, was considerably easier than doing any actual police work. But it was also considerably more boring, too. If I'm being honest, I thought it would consist of breaking up crazy parties, rescuing hot sorority girls from whatever jam they gotten themselves into, maybe even getting a few compliments that are usually directed at a guy in uniform, but nope. All my job consisted of was walking around campus for like 8 hours a day, just making sure buildings were secure and that the right doors were locked. On top of that, I had very little training and basically no means of defending myself whatsoever. I was constantly worrying about what I'd do if I'd actually ran into any serious criminal activity, but luckily I never did. But I can't say the same for some other campus security guards, and that's pretty much the whole reason I'm writing this up. Okay, so Virginia Wesleyan University is a small Methodist college in Norfolk, Virginia, with a total population of less than 1,500 students, and back in 2006, it was even smaller than it is now. It's located near Virginia Beach in the Hampton Roads area of the state, which actually has a relatively high crime rate, but the college itself is pretty safe, and historically there's been very little in the way of trouble there. It's kind of like a little green island of bliss in the middle of an urban concrete sea, and the students that attended rarely say anything bad about it except around exam times. Back in 2006, it didn't have anything resembling a campus police force. Now, almost all American colleges have an attachment of uniformed police to keep them safe. But back then, Wesleyan only employed a small number of unarmed security officials to keep the peace. And one of these was a guy named Walter Zakshevsky, known as Wally or Officer Wally among his colleagues in the student body. Wally was actually from Chicago to begin with, but after joining the U.S. Navy and spending a good chunk of his military career down in Norfolk, it became kind of a home away from home. I know his wife is from the area and the pair moved back to Chicago after he got out of the military, but at 57, when Wally got laid off from a steel industry job in the Windy City and got sick to death of the weather, the couple moved back down to Virginia, and Wally took up a job as a campus security officer at Wesleyan University. Wally has absolutely no experience in security or law enforcement, but I'm guessing the college didn't mind that since he was ex-military and was therefore seen as being disciplined and reliable. He started in July of 2006, and what followed was basically 3 months of on-the-job training in which Wally came to love his new job. His only real complaint was how hot and humid the campus could be in the summer months, but he grew to love the student population, who viewed him as a kind of warm, friendly guardian-type figure, someone they could trust and rely on in their time of need. Then, on October 11th of that same year, Wally was getting ready for his evening shift patrolling the campus. He was wearing his regular uniform consisting of a blue dress shirt, black pants, and a duty belt containing the usual security-type tools and gadgets: handcuffs, baton, flashlight, radio, but most certainly no firearm. Many of the other security staff at the college carried pepper spray, but Wally wasn't authorized to carry any because of how new on the job he was. It had recently been his and his wife's 34th wedding anniversary, so the pair were particularly in love around that time, so he made sure to give her hugs and kisses before he headed off to work that evening. According to the records from that night, everything seemed pretty uneventful. It was just a regular shift on the sleepy college campus. Just before 10 p.m., Wally apparently made a radio call to the campus security headquarters, informing them that he was about to undertake a routine building check. Security staff regularly checked in with headquarters so that clerks working there could make notes on their movements and activities, but after that call, Wally didn't check in again. This was undoubtedly unusual. It certainly wasn't like Wally to miss a radio check, so officials back at headquarters assumed that there had been some kind of radio malfunction, such as a loss of signal. This was their final conclusion, too. Not that something bad might have happened, so no police were called, and no other members of the security team were sent to check anything out. Wally's evening shift was due to end at 11 p.m., and he usually arrived back at headquarters for a debrief shortly before his shift was due to end so he could properly hand over to the next guy on duty. But that night, Wally never arrived back at headquarters. Almost a half hour went by and there was still no signs of Wally, and it still proved impossible to get in touch with him via the radio network. Naturally, his colleagues began to worry, and a handful of security officers took off around campus to try and find him. One of these officers was the shift commander, a guy called Vic Dorsey. Dorsey was checking out the Boy Dining Center at around 11:30 p.m. when a grisly sight greeted him near the entrance. Wally was unconscious, lying in a pool of his own blood, having received multiple stab wounds around his arms and torso. Someone had evidently violently attacked him, and while Wally seemed to have attempted to pull out his baton to defend himself, he simply didn't stand a chance. Head of campus security said that when he got the call shortly after Dorsey had found Wally's body, all he needed to hear was the man's tone of voice to know the worst had occurred. Dorsey only managed to get out one word out before he burst into tears. Wally. Virginia Beach police were called in, who immediately took over the investigation into Wally's murder. One of the first things they did was to confiscate knives from anyone on campus who happened to be carrying on for whatever reason. Even the head of campus security was considered a suspect for the time being, and was made to hand over the small utility knife he kept on his keyring, despite the fact that he wasn't actually present on campus at the time of the murder. Virginia Beach Police Department also demanded that every member of the security team, as well as all other employees on campus, get down to the local department for interviews and polygraph tests. Every single member of the security team seemed only too keen to cooperate with the investigation, all except one, who apparently turned down the polygraph tests out of medical and religious reasons. As a result of lack of witnesses, clues, and CCTV footage, the investigation came up short pretty soon after it was opened up. But I'm hoping my own little analysis will be able to jog someone's memory or convince someone to come forward. Someone must know something. Someone must have seen something. Heck, even if it's the person that actually killed Wally, they should just man up, do the right thing and admit what they did so we can all get a little closure. I mean, I did Wally's job, and that legit could have been me out there that night, stabbed to death securing a building from someone that just shouldn't have been there. And that thought alone is enough to give me chills. Personally, I have one main theory that I think explains what happened to Wally that night. Given that the encounter was outside of the dining center where students spend a fair amount of cash on their lunches and other sweet treats, a thief may have believed that there might well have been a great deal of cash left in the building overnight. He probably saw Wally, recognized the uniform, then attacked in the knowledge that Wally probably wouldn't be carrying any kind of firearm. The college itself might have been considered an easy target for any kind of serious criminal who might have known that there was very little in the way of security presence there. Yet there was absolutely no sign of any kind of break-in or an attempt at forced entry, nor had the college been the target of any organized burglaries before that time. This has given rise to other theories that some kind of grudge or dispute between coworkers led to Wally's death. After all, there was one member of the security team that refused to take a polygraph test, and if you ask me, that's probably the most suspicious thing about this entire case. It's also really curious that there was no CCTV footage of the attack. Another member of the security team would have known where the cameras were at and therefore where the best place to attack Wally would be. Yet Wally was a very popular member of the team, so what could he have done to incur someone's anger in such a way is almost totally beyond me. In the words of Marianne Zarchevsky, Wally's widow, I just want to ask them why. Why didn't you just leave? Why did you have to hurt him? And perhaps the most tragic thing I've learned about the events surrounding Wally's death is that just a few months before he was murdered, the head of campus security had been asking the college to pony up the cash to hire some actual trained, armed police officers. Leo Tarian, head of security, has pretty much openly admitted that it was hideously unfair to put untrained and unprepared people in a situation that might lead to encounters with armed and violent criminals. But he also puts it out there that the college was vehemently against the hiring of armed off-duty officers, on the grounds that it would create a negative atmosphere on campus by frightening the students. After Wally's death, Wesleyan College not only hired an off-duty officer but offered a $25,000 reward out of their own pocket for any information leading to the identification and arrest of Officer Wally's killer. A shadow box containing a photo of Wally, his now retired badge, and a medal now hangs in the Wesleyan security office, with the box bearing the inscription, "For the ultimate sacrifice." But as sad and tragic as the whole thing is, it pales in comparison to the terrifying idea that a man could be killed in such a brutal fashion while at work, with one of his own colleagues as perhaps the main suspect, and that still, to this day, not a single person has been charged or convicted over his murder. We can only hope that Wally and his widow managed to find some measure of peace.